All right, I think we're ready now at 9:07 to turn to the formal last day of our hearing. I see that we have our witness Don McIver present, and Mr. McIver will get to you as soon as we do the formal preliminaries, including a roll call of the council members and a roll call of our parties formally on the record. So good morning, everybody. Good morning, council members. It is Friday, April 25th, and rarely has it been a TGIF like today must feel, but it is our last day 8 of 8 for the hearing in the Horse Heaven Wind Farm project. I'm going to ask that staff take the council roll.
FSEC Chair.
Kathleen Drew here.
Department of Commerce.
Elizabeth Osborne, present.
Department of Ecology.
Eli Levitt here.
Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Mike Livingston, present.
Department of Natural Resources.
Mr. Young may just have stepped away.
Yeah.
I think he was in.
Yeah,
sorry.
sorry, the audio cut out here briefly, Your Honor. Lenny Young for Department of Natural Resources, present.
Thank you. Utilities and Transportation Commission.
Stacy Brewster, present.
For the Horse Heaven Project, Department of Agriculture. And Benton County.
Did we see Mr. Brost?
I
Today?
did not. I have not seen him yet this morning.
All right, we'll keep an eye out for when Mr. Brost joins us. So it sounds like we have the chair and +5 today. For those council members present, it's the last chance for me to put on the record any ex parte contacts that may have occurred through the course of the hearing. Anything to disclose? I'm seeing some shaking heads to the negative. All right, well, maybe doing this stuff virtually precludes a lot of ex parte contacts. So that's a different experience than I've had before, but maybe a good positive outcome of this. Ms. Reineveld, we're going to take your witness today, Mr. McIver, and I'm going to have to scroll to the exhibit list to see what he's sponsoring. And then I want to take a look with you as to any chance we're going to be into closed session today. I think it's rather high. So we can have staff build out the list of folks that need to get from the public session into the closed record. So I see from Mr. McIver, he's got response testimony starting with 3001. We have both the confidential and the redacted version. We have 3002, a cumulative effects study, 3003, another study, 3004 and 3005, some additional studies, 3006, 7, 8, 9, and 10. These are all on page 11 and 12 of your exhibit list. 3011, 3012, 3013, 14, and 15, and 3016. Parties, were there other cross-exam exhibits for Mr. McIver that can easily be identified?
I don't anticipate any, Your Honor.
Did any other party have cross-exam exhibits specifically for Mr. McIver that haven't already been admitted? All right, I'm not seeing any. So, Mr. McIver, good morning. I'm Adam Torm. I'm the administrative law judge and riding herd on this, if nothing else. And so we have your exhibits 3000 through 3016. I'll swear you in and ask you to adopt those and any other answers you're going to give today. If you have updates to your testimony we should know about, you can provide those up front. And then my schedule says that the applicant, and you've already heard Willa Perlmutter identify herself, I think, as the attorney. She'll start, and then Ms. Shona Volkers of the Yakama Nation also has some questions for you. So we'll proceed through those now. Sir, if you'll raise your right hand. Do you, Don McIver, solemnly swear or affirm that all testimony in the exhibits we just recited that you'll be adopting, and any answers you give to questions today asked by attorneys or council members will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to consider those exhibits 3000 through 3016 now admitted, and our staff, Ms. Massengale, is going to do that. Mark the exhibit list accordingly. Ms. Reineveld, did you want to give a quick introduction to the witness, to the council members, kind of put everybody on the page where we're going today? And then Ms. Perlmutter, I'll call on you next.
Certainly, Your Honor. Mr. MacGyver is a wildlife ecologist. He's prepared to testify regarding the responsive and supplemental testimony he provided on behalf of Council for the Environment on the project's impacts to wildlife and habitat and recommendations to mitigate and/or avoid those impacts.
All right, with that introduction, Ms. Perlmutter, I'll let you start with the cross-exam and we'll turn to Ms. Volkers. And Mr. MacGyver, just so you can anticipate, we may go back and forth with the lawyers a little bit, and then I'll call on the chair of the council and all the council members to see if they have questions. And I think there's a pretty high likelihood there's a few council members that will.
Okay. Your Honor, you offered an opportunity at this juncture for me to offer a correction, and I would have a very small one, but I think an important one that I would like to get on the record. And that is in my supplemental responsive testimony. That's Exhibit 3016, I believe. On the first page of that testimony, and my first answer, I indicated that the Region 6 U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service requires a 2-mile buffer around ferruginous hawk nests, and it actually is a 1-mile buffer. Minor math error on my part, transferring from kilometers to miles, but I think that's an important point to note as we get into this.
All right, well, I'm glad we're not using the metric system today, but saves public math, and I'll hand you over to Ms. Perlmutter.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Your Honor. Mr. MacGyver, I was planning on grilling you on the difference between radius and diameter, but you've completely shut off that line of questioning. My name is Willa Perlmutter, and I represent the applicant in this matter. And as I know you expect, I've got some questions to ask you this morning. And Ms. Massingale, can we please call up Exhibit 3001?
Yes, and did you want to show the redacted version right now, or do we need to go into a closed section to show the unredacted version?
The redacted version is fine.
Got it, thank you.
Thanks so much. Mr. MacGyver, I'd like to start actually by talking about some things that we can agree on. And so we're looking at your initial testimony that you provided. And specifically, I'd like to look at page 3. Do you have a copy of that with you?
I do.
Awesome.
I also see it on my screen. Yes.
Great. And really, it's up for other people's benefit as much as for yours. I'd just like to turn to page 3 and confirm with me, please, that on page 3 you indicate that for this particular project, the applicant exceeded the usual effort for wind facilities to document bat use at the site. Is that right?
I would say that's a fair characterization. Yes, I made that statement and still agree with it.
And you also said that the applicant concluded that the local breeding population is small. You agree with that, don't you?
Referring specifically to bats and hoary and silver-haired, yes.
Understood. Thanks for narrowing me in on that. And you also agreed with the applicant's conclusion that we're mostly talking about migratory bats at the site. Is that right?
Yes.
And on page 4, you noted that the applicant arrived at a reasonable estimate of the project's impacts on bats. Is that right?
Eventually, yes.
Okay. And you did specifically note that the applicant's estimate, in your opinion, constituted a proper application of the best available data. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And on page 6, you note that the application accurately quantifies the project's potential impacts to avifauna. Is that right?
Yes, I would say potentially exclusive of ferruginous hawk, but more broadly the avifauna in general. Yes.
And so, could you educate me, because I'm a lawyer and not a scientist? When you talk about avifauna, What does that mean?
Birds. It's just a fancy word for birds. It's you know, wildlife, but specifically the bird portion of the wildlife.
Thank you. I'm planning on using that at the dinner table tonight, for the record. You also on page 6 say that the analysis of the project's analysis of the impacts to birds is, quote, well informed by greater than typical efforts to collect bird use activity data. Do you still agree with that statement?
Yes, I do.
And on page 6, you also note that there's no reason to expect that the project will have a disproportionate impact on general avifauna. And I know you're excluding bats from that. I'm sorry, you're excluding ferruginous hawks from that. But otherwise, you agree with that statement.
Yes, I do.
And on page 7, you note that the revised application includes adequate safeguards and appropriate mitigation for general avifauna. Again, you're still good with that?
Yes, I am.
On the same page, you note that the applicant accurately quantified the project's potential impact on ferruginous hawks. That statement still holds?
I would um, accurately quantifies potential impacts. That was the question on ferruginous hawks. That was your question. Am I correct?
Yes, it is.
Um, I I would say that no, based on what I have learned through the process of discovery that we've all been going through here. I think there are some gaps in the quantification of impacts or potential impacts to ferruginous hawks through this
But
project.
my apology.
No, go ahead.
And I'll do my best not to interrupt you. It's a bad habit I have. But certainly as of July 5th, you noted that, in your opinion, the applicant accurately quantified the potential impacts on ferruginous hawks. Is that right?
That was my belief at that time, yes.
Okay, we'll get to the change
Okay.
shortly, as you might imagine. And you've noted on page 7 of your initial testimony, you've noted other threats to the ferruginous hawk. And you talk about impacts or threats extrinsic to the proposed project. What do you mean by that?
Well, the ferruginous hawks situation, its population status, is the product of a wide range of negative influences. And a significant number of those influences occur range wide. So they are not limited to the project footprint, whether it was built or not. And there are things like, as others have enumerated through this process, but things like decline in its prey, things like loss of habitat, fragmentation of habitat, collisions, shooting, poisoning. There are a number of factors that have been identified that occur in other parts of its range.
So let me say this to you, and you tell me if I'm getting this right. That's what you've just described is kind of a scientific way of saying that these birds have lots of threats, things that have nothing to do with the project. Is that right?
Yeah, that's true. But I would also say that collision with wind towers has been identified as one of the threats and one of the sources of mortality for these birds.
Can you quantify that?
Well, in the state of Washington, I think roughly starting with the date of when wind energy facilities started being implemented up until today, there have been, I believe, 4 mortalities associated with wind energy facilities. And I believe the number, if you cast the geographic net a little bit wider, the Columbia plateau ecoregion, I think the number is 8
And-
mortalities.
Going back how far again?
Roughly 2008, 2010, somewhere in there, I believe.
And you refer on page 7, you talk about disturbance as being one of the threats to the ferruginous hawks. What do you mean by that?
Right, a good question. The bird is known to be sensitive to human disturbance. And so it appears that it demonstrates some avoidance behavior in the presence of human disturbance. And so that's one of the concerns that's associated with any project that's implemented on the landscape in the hawks range. So at some point, we see these hawks out foraging, at least, and I'll make the distinction between foraging and nesting. So we see these hawks out foraging where there might be single lane farm access roads or backcountry gravel roads. That doesn't seem, just subjectively, to present a significant obstacle for the birds or something, or a stimulus that they want to avoid. But at some point, if you get enough human disturbance, enough construction, enough activity, the birds do start avoiding the landscapes and changing their behavior.
So would that include things like residential development?
It certainly could, yes.
And just so I'm clear, when you talk about avoidance, you're talking about, again, to put it in lay terms, would I be right if I thought about this as things that the birds don't like are happening on the ground, so they go someplace else? They use other flyways and things?
That's a very good, succinct description, yes.
At page 9 of your initial testimony, you were talking specifically about artificial nests.
Mhm.
And again, if I'm right, you said that that the applicant's artificial nest effort could help bolster regional populations. Is that right?
Yes, it certainly could. Could I offer a little bit of insight into that, a little bit of nuance?
Sure.
Well, I think this is a very interesting opportunity that the applicant has put forward. And it's not, here's this word again, novel, in the sense that there has been an effort in the state to place artificial nest platforms for ferruginous hawks. So this would not be the first attempt. What is not apparent from my reading of the reports is whether or not those efforts in the state of Washington to supplement nesting opportunities through artificial platforms have been successful. I think WDFW has put out, in conjunction with partners, something like 85 nest platforms. And I cannot find any data on occupancy rates or use rates for those platforms, except for one effort in 2019 where 29 platforms were put out and 2 were occupied. So that's a very low occupancy rate. That's about 7%. But that data was incorporated into some of Mr. Jansen's modeling efforts, and he footnoted that piece of data by saying that the platforms were put out and the observations on their use made in the same season. So that's really probably not enough length of time to understand if the platforms are adopted by the birds or accepted. So the point being, I think in Washington, we don't really have an understanding of how readily those platforms are adopted. We do know that the nesting in the occupied number of occupied territories in Washington is a small percentage of those available. It's about 18% of territories are occupied. So, you know, how successful supplemental nesting platforms would be remains to be seen. I think it's, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
I was going to say, I think it's a worthy experiment. And I think that the applicant's offer to do that as an add-on measure is generous. And the monitoring that they've offered to accompany it is essential and also generous. So it's an experiment that's probably worth doing. It's got to be done very carefully, very thoughtfully. Those platforms have to go in just the right place so that they supplement the population, not just move birds from, say, a natural nest to a platform. You've got to increase the breeding population. And you can't do it at the expense of encouraging competitors to the ferruginous hawk. So there's a lot of moving pieces here. It's not a panacea.
Thank you very much for that clarification. So a couple things just on that one answer. You talk about doing it thoughtfully and strategically, placing artificial nests, and you'd expect that the applicants, wildlife biologists, and potentially a technical advisory committee would be thoughtful and strategic in that way, wouldn't you?
Yes. Yes.
And when you talk about opportunistic, I think the phrase that you used, or providing artificial nest platforms, it sounds like for competing species. I just want to make sure I understand. Again, let me say this to you and you tell me if I'm right. You don't want to put up a bunch of artificial nests so predators of ferruginous hawk can come in and say, hey, great, you've given us these great hunting blinds to use to go after ferruginous hawks. Is that right?
You may actually be a wildlife biologist. Yes.
And when you talk about Mr. Jansen, we're talking about Eric Jansen, who testified in this matter.
Yes, correct.
And one question, if I represented to you that the post-construction fatality monitoring, you had talked about the documented bird fatalities, ferruginous hawk fatalities, that there were, you said 4 in Washington. If I represented to you that post-construction fatality monitoring in the Columbia Plateau started in 1999, would you have any reason to disagree with that?
No,
Ms. Perlmutter, while we're still on this particular subject of nesting or other breeding platforms, the witness's testimony sounded like in Washington, which of course is our jurisdiction here. I wanted to see while we're there if there was any studies outside of Washington that might be indicative of what best practices would be post-construction accommodation of these birds and encouragement of these birds. So if that's okay with you, either I can ask the question or maybe it's already out there or you can.
I suppose it would be inappropriate for me to tell you to mind your own business. No, of course, I'm fine with Mr. MacIver answering that question.
Outside the hearing, that would be just fine. But today, I'll take it. So, Mr. MacIver, straying outside of Washington, is there any other indication of the ferruginous hawk that these have worked?
That's a really, really good and important question. There are other studies from within the range of the hawk, ferruginous hawk, that have looked at artificial nesting platforms and whether the hawks are using them. Those studies have occurred in Alberta, Wyoming, Utah, possibly Nevada. The problem is that those are landscapes that offer different opportunities to the ferruginous hawk than what is offered in Washington. So the birds are probably reacting differently to the nesting opportunities. Mr. Watson, Jim Watson, in his testimony, made the point that in the Alberta portion of the Ferruginous Hawks range, they're primarily in grasslands with a different prey base, primarily, I think it was primarily jackrabbits. I do recall a different prey base, and fewer nesting opportunities. So putting out platforms there, they were, I think, reasonably well accepted, as one might expect, where, say, trees for nesting are quite limited. The highest rate of nest platform use has been in Wyoming. And again, it's a bit of a different environment, big sagebrush, and not as many trees, I would say, generally, where they range in Wyoming. And I think that they probably perceive the nest platforms as being advantageous, perhaps offering a higher perch from which to see predators and or prey. So how the birds respond to the presence or opportunities for nest platforms is going to be influenced to some degree by what other opportunities their habitat, immediately surrounding habitat, offers to them. So it's very risky, I think, to extrapolate from other states and experiences in other parts of their range to our situation in Washington.
Your Honor, do you have follow-up?
No, I think that took us as far afield as I wanted to go.
No pun intended, Your Honor.
Never.
So Mr. McIver, to go back then to your statement on page 9, with all of this nuance that you provided, what I'm hearing is that the proposed artificial nest effort might help bolster regional populations. That there's not enough data at this point, and there are too many variables in what's going to happen to know. But it's possible, and certainly we would all hope for that. Is that right?
Yes, correct. Yes.
And I actually want to go back for one quick second. One other question about the threats that you noted extrinsic to the proposed project, to the ferruginous hawk. One that you didn't mention that I neglected to mention is climate change. Would you agree with me that climate change poses a giant threat to the ferruginous hawk?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. And so to go back to page 9 of your initial testimony, you noted that the ferruginous hawk was not documented using solar sites since data collection began. Is that right?
That I believe that's correct. Yes.
And you also said that the site's utility for hawks in this region is hypothetical. That's right at the it's near it's the in the last full paragraph of your response on page 9.
Oh.
There you go.
Right, and the sites referring specifically to solar sites. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And you said that planted grasses beneath solar arrays might actually offer small mammals an attractive food source. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And also offer them protection from predation. Is that right?
Right. Right.
And so your conclusion there, if I understand correctly, is that could present foraging opportunities for ferruginous hawks as animals disperse from these areas. So if I get this right, that if I understand what you're talking about is planted grass beneath solar arrays might actually create a beneficial environment for the stuff that ferruginous hawks eat.
Yeah, and this is skating on some fairly thin ice for me. It's a very hypothetical situation. What I would say about solar arrays is that there is nothing analogous in ferruginous hawks' preferred habitat. So if you think about the fact that they've evolved in the high desert ecosystem, you can't really go out and walk through that ecosystem and say, well, that's substantively similar to a solar array panel, and look, the hawks are using it. They're birds of open country. They need that open country to find their prey and to forage. So if you think about the way a solar array is structured, it has three-dimensional height, thickness, relatively close together. I find, based on the hawk's foraging strategy and their morphology, I find it difficult to believe, and the fact that they tend to avoid human development, I find it difficult to believe that ferruginous hawk would attempt to forage, attack prey inside a solar array. So I think, blocking that out, I think it becomes terrain that they would not physically use. Could there be some ancillary benefit? Well, there have been studies that indicate that wildlife use these facilities, some wildlife, and it could be because of the planted grasses there, which would be more heterogeneous, more complex than a planted wheat field. It could offer some forage or some opportunities for small mammals. If their populations grew to be robust enough, they would need to disperse, they would leave the solar arrays, and there could be something for the hawk to forage on. But that's very hypothetical. There are no studies I'm aware of that have looked at that.
Understood. And again, thank you. But so let me again try to put this in my now amateur wildlife biologist way, which is that that it looks as though the solar arrays may actually be beneficial to the prey species for the things that ferruginous hawks eat. Is that right?
It's possible.
And when you talk about animals dispersing from these areas, if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that if this is a good environment, sooner or later those prey species are going to leave the solar arrays, and that would then flush them out into the open, to grossly oversimplify, where they could be actually preyed upon by ferruginous hawks. Is that right?
Again, it's a hypothetical scenario, but it is possible.
Okay. And on page 11, you talk about the threats to the prey of the ferruginous hawk. And we've talked about some of those things already, habitat conversion, poisoning, shooting, that kind of thing. You also talk about wildfires being a threat to ferruginous hawk prey.
Mhm.
What does that mean?
Well, this circles back to your question about climate change, because this is the nexus, this is the link, or at least the primary nexus related to climate change. One of the major problems, certainly one of the major problems in the high desert is that we have a number of invasive plant species. Probably the worst being cheatgrass. Our native shrub steppe habitats evolved in the presence of fire, but they evolved to burn, some subtle distinctions, roughly every 75 to 100 years. Well, cheatgrass, which comes from the steppes of Asia, evolved to burn roughly every 3 years. So what happens is when wildfires occur in the shrub steppe landscapes, the cheatgrass is already there, at least in low levels. The native habitat, native vegetation burns, the cheatgrass thrives, creates fuel for the next fire event, and shortens that fire return cycle. So instead of the next fire event occurring in 75 years, it may occur in 30 years or 20 years or 10 years. And when they start occurring more frequently, the native vegetation gets obliterated and gets replaced with cheatgrass. So cheatgrass has very limited habitat and forage value for wildlife. Things like chukar evolved with cheatgrass. Chukar is not a native species either. They do okay in cheatgrass, but for the vast majority of our native wildlife, it's complete habitat loss. And so the prey, like the small mammals, likewise has a very hard time once its habitat is converted to a cheatgrass monotype, and it has a hard time thriving for sure.
And can you just connect the dots for me? When you talk, and certainly the story that you're telling is very clear. Can you connect that to the effects of climate change, please?
Sure. So cheatgrass is adapted to not only to fire but also to dry climates. It needs winter moisture. It's a winter grass essentially. So it comes out, emerges very early in the season, and part of the problem with climate change is that with warming cycles, we get more drought and we get increasing stress on our native plants, and we get a longer dry season, therefore a longer window in which wildfires can occur. So less moisture in the landscape, higher risk of fire, and a longer period of time over which those fires can occur each year.
So let me say this to you and put it at a 72,000 foot level.
Mhm.
So climate change is not only directly a bad thing for ferruginous hawks, it's also a bad thing for the prey that ferruginous hawk eat. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd say the two are linked. That probably the effect of climate change is more profoundly felt on the habitat and on the prey, and then that's reflected up to the ferruginous hawk and the challenges it has making a living on the landscape.
Thanks. That's actually very clear. I'd like to turn to page 13 of your initial testimony. And I understand that you're speaking about animals other than bats here, but it's your opinion here that the application accurately quantifies the project's impacts on mammals generally. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And you found that the proposed mitigation measures are reasonable and likely to be sufficient.
Yes.
And okay, so when you say antelope in this testimony, we're talking about what we've been referring to as pronghorn. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And this is possibly the most ridiculous question anybody has ever been asked in an adjudication. But when we talk about pronghorn, you'd agree that we're talking about mammals. Is that right?
Yes, I would.
I have to say that asking that question, I was a little out on a tightrope because I thought if I get this one wrong, that's a big problem.
I appreciate an easy question periodically. That was a good one. Thank you.
Now you've noted that before construction begins, the site should be surveyed for the presence of Townsend's ground squirrels. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
But you've also indicated that survey, those surveys would be conducted before the site design is finalized and before construction begins, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And on page 15, you note that antelope generally avoid wind energy facilities.
Yes, that's what the literature indicates. And I believe Mr. Remick testified to this as well, but the findings from the literature are a little bit ambiguous, but the preponderance of evidence tends to suggest avoidance. I think, again, if there's a qualifying tag to that statement, it would be that how the animals respond is likely somewhat dependent on what other options are available to them. So if using this project as an example, if this project were implemented and the antelope perceived it as less desirable than some other landscape that's available to them, they probably would switch to using that other landscape. If there were no other alternatives and there were no severe threats, say predation, which of course we wouldn't expect, but just speaking biologically, if they did not perceive a severe threat like that, they probably would continue to use the landscape. But yes, the literature tends to suggest avoidance.
And when you say they would continue to use the landscape, you mean the landscape around wind facilities, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And you referred to Mr. Ramig's testimony on Wednesday. He actually testified that the data is conflicting regarding whether antelope actually do avoid wind facilities. Isn't that right?
That's consistent with what I was just trying to say. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I want to talk for a bit about this 2-mile offset. On page 11 of your testimony, you've taken issue with Mr. Nutzman's one-size-fits-all approach to offset. Do you see that?
I'm aware of that statement. I don't see it right now, but yeah, I'm aware of that.
Let me see if I could. Well, at the first big answer, the one that that is right by the cursor right there.
Yeah.
You actually, Nutzman says there should be a 2-mile offset, and you actually initially suggested that that 2-mile offset is somewhat arbitrary. Is that right?
It is as I think I explained here, in the sense that the core areas around which this concept is based are not a uniform circle. I mean, that's not how ferruginous hawks perceive the landscape. So it's easy, isn't it, to just draw a circle on the map and say 2 miles, we're done. It's not necessarily a reflection of biological reality and how a hawk may be using the landscape. So I think that's the point that I was making. And I think it would be possible, if the data are available, but I think it would be possible to look at these specific sites and understand a little bit better how hawk might be using them and to determine boundaries that are biologically appropriate to the situation. But my level of understanding of this specific site is not adequate to go to that place. But I would hope that that level of understanding exists within WDFW and probably some of the West staff or Tetra Tech staff who have been working on this project probably have a better understanding of the landscape specifics.
I just need to say this because I like saying it. You don't expect ferruginous hawks to move in circles. You would expect them to move in something that is more like an asymmetrical polygon. Is that right?
At least not a circle, yes.
Okay.
Something more abstract.
That's fair. One of the things that I've come across refers to it actually as an amoeba pattern.
I like that. Yeah, we'll work with that.
It's and the answer that you've given is terrific. In terms of the need to tailor offsets to the needs of this specific site. You actually you advocate for a more nuanced and biologically informed approach. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
And
Yes.
I want to just nail this down to be clear. The 2 miles that Mr. Nutzman talked about, that refers to the distance around nests, not the distance around equipment. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And your testimony, your initial testimony suggests that a better approach would be to respond to actual conditions at the site. That's what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yes.
And that's consistent with the suggestion you made in your supplemental testimony that the buffer should be tailored to accommodate the project specific needs, right?
Yes.
But between your original testimony and this supplemental testimony, you actually changed your answer about a 2-mile buffer. Am I right?
Yes.
And can you explain, please, how you came to make that change in your testimony?
Sure.
I mean, what led to you making the change?
Sure. Well, let's see here. Keep me on track. Initially, when I submitted my first testimony, I was going off of two sources of information. One was the 2004 WDFW recommendations, and it's on the record. I'm sorry that the exact citation is not coming to mind, but it's long been in discussion here about a source of the offset figures. And the other background that I was using was the references from the application indicating that some personal communications had gone on, some consultation with WDFW over this exact figure. And so it was my assumption at that time that the smaller offsets, which have fluctuated a bit in size, were derived from consultation. So since that time, I've had a chance to review Mr. Watson's testimony as well as his recent publications on the ferruginous hawk in Washington and in this area. And he has brought up some new information that is, I think, very important to consider and very compelling. And the 2-mile buffer is his recommendation, or maybe I should say more broadly, coming from WDFW. And I think, first off, it's based more than any of these other numbers that have been put out for a buffer size. It is based in traceable biology. In other words, the 2 miles is reflective of his findings of the size of core areas that ferruginous hawks use to maintain and occupy their nest territories. So we can tie that number back to a biological reality. The second reason I think that the 2-mile offset is valid is, I'm not quite sure what category to lump this into, but say more of a administrative category, in the sense that WDFW is the agency that is responsible for managing this bird in the state. They are the agency that will be responsible for recovering this bird, recovering its populations in the state. So I would give them significant deference in identifying what they need, what they believe is necessary to recover this bird's population within the state.
You didn't, you sort of answered the question, but not quite. Can you just tell me sort of mechanically, how did you come to make that change? Did somebody call you? Did you call somebody else to say, hey, I got this wrong, I need to fix it? How did it come about that you submitted supplemental testimony?
I read Watson's, as I said, read Watson's testimony, read his papers, and concluded that my initial testimony should be revised, was incorrect. And so I approached Ms. Reineveld and said, I think this needs to change.
So it's your idea to make the change?
Yes.
Okay. And the change that you're talking about, that doesn't change your conclusion that this needs to be a nuanced, as you said, a nuanced and biologically informed approach to an offset. Is that right?
That's correct. And if I could add just a little bit to that, Mr. Jansen has put forward some information, which again is part of the record, looking at the status of hawks in the project area, and specifically nesting attempts, nesting territories. He has made a point through those submittals that there is encroachment on the site of residential developments. And some of those residential developments are in close proximity to historic ferruginous hawk nest sites. So I think that given the biology of the hawk, I think that's a valid concern. And I think that there is a logical conversation which should take place about whether some of those nesting territories in proximity to residential development are ever going to be viable again for the ferruginous hawk. And this is a conversation that needs to come again from the managing agency, from WDFW. So I think they need to weigh in on that and really do a realistic assessment of what kind of territory can be maintained. Because one of the things that's absolutely critical here with regards to the species is that even though we have unoccupied territories in proximity to the proposed project, we've got to maintain enough open territories suitable for reoccupation that as the population starts to recover, it has places to go. It has places to re-expand into. So that's really why it's so important to look at these historic sites and think about whether or not they could be repopulated as the ferruginous hawk recovers.
Your Honor, I'd ask that entire response be stricken as non-responsive.
Ms.
With all
Reineville?
respect to Mr. McIver.
Ms.
I
Reineville,
think
any
it was responsive to her question.
Your Honor, if I may, it was not. I asked about just the appropriateness. I asked him if he continued then to believe that this should be, the approach to buffers should be continue to be nuanced and biologically informed. And although it was an interesting discussion and something that I will revisit in other ways, in terms of talking about the need to leave habitat open so that maybe these birds will come back someday, that's all non-responsive to my question.
I agree it was an interesting answer, but considering the original question, it was non-responsive. So we'll strike anything that didn't go directly to Ms. Perlmutter's question. I'll work with the court reporter to take a look at that and strike the appropriate material later.
Thank you very much.
Right.
And Mr. McIver, again, no disrespect meant. Ms. Massengale, would you be so kind, please, as to put up Exhibit 3016R? Wow, thank you. Mr. McIver, you've already started by talking about Region 6 of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and your mistake that it's not a 2-mile buffer, it's a 1-mile buffer that they recommend. Is that right?
That's correct.
And they don't require a buffer like that. That's just their recommendation. Am I correct?
I would have to go back and look. My statement in my testimony, as you see, said requires. I would have to go back and double check as to whether that's a recommendation or a requirement.
If I told you that it was a recommendation, you wouldn't have any problem with that?
No, I wouldn't.
Okay. And And various other states also propose buffers when it comes to ferruginous hawk interaction with wind facilities. Am I right?
I'm sure they do. I'm not aware of specifics. I would expect that they do. I am not aware of specifics on this question.
And just to be clear, the ferruginous hawk is not a federally listed species, is it?
That's correct.
And so going back to these other states, Utah and Colorado, they both recommend narrower buffers, don't they?
I'm sorry, I don't know.
Okay, if I told you they did, you wouldn't have any reason to disagree.
No.
Okay. No, you would not disagree.
No, I would not disagree.
Thank you. And you would agree with me, please, that there's no published guidance in Washington about what a buffer should be with regard to a ferruginous hawk territory. Am I right?
Junction as the definition of published guidance. I think that's vague and an issue that's in dispute.
Okay, Mr. MacIver, Your Honor, I'm fine with that. I can change the question.
Yep, that's fine. Go ahead.
Mr. MacIver, if I talk about published guidance, what does that mean to you?
Well, it's publicly available information that has either appeared in a peer-reviewed journal or been issued by an agency or organization through their own channels.
Would you agree with me that Washington's DFW has not published guidance regarding buffers when it comes to ferruginous hawks and wind facilities?
No, I would disagree with you because the 2004 priority habitats and species guidance does give some buffer recommendations, not specific, as I recall, to wind energy, but to human disturbance activities. And it also gives some leeway to biologists to assign buffer sizes appropriate to the situation at hand. Give some latitude for interpretation. I think that's a better way to say that.
Thanks. That's helpful. Looking at page 3 of your supplemental testimony.
Oops.
You with me? Okay. And in fact, to go back to this previous answer, the question was asked whether the recommendation had been formalized through agency guidance, and you said that the recommendation was given verbally and or in written communications. When you say verbally, you mean orally? Somebody said that?
Yes.
And in written communications, you mean by letters or emails rather than in a published document. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. On that same page, you say that the 2-mile buffer would permit project implementation while preserving opportunities for species recovery. What's the basis for that conclusion?
Yeah, I think I think that's probably overstepping the bounds of my knowledge. I think we would need some additional analysis to understand whether or not the project could be implemented in the presence of a 2-mile buffer.
Okay. And just to be clear, you're not suggesting that responsibility for recovering the ferruginous hawk species rests on the applicant's shoulders, right?
Absolutely not. No.
Okay. Yes, it does not rest on the applicant's shoulders.
Correct.
Okay. And in fact, there's no requirement that FSEC consider the recovery of species when issuing a site certification agreement. Am I right?
I can't answer that question. I don't know.
Okay. If I told you I was right, you wouldn't have any reason for disagreeing with me.
I would have no basis for arguing with you.
I love that. Thank you. Can you say how much area would be taken out of availability if this 2-mile buffer were imposed?
No, I can't because I think there's insufficient information in my court for me to answer that question.
Can you tell me how many of the proposed turbines would be eliminated by the 2-mile buffer?
No, I cannot.
Um, would the 2-mile buffer apply to both active and historical nests?
Yes, yes, they would.
How many active ferruginous hawk nests are there in Washington State?
Active. The last survey found 34 pairs of, so 34 nesting territories.
And that's across the full state.
Yes,
And what was the date of that last survey?
I believe that was last year.
Okay. And how many active nests are there in the project area?
There are none currently active as of this year.
How many historical nests are there in Washington State?
I think it's 284. How's that for specific? That's what my memory recalls. We'll put that in the ballpark.
It's good enough for me. Of those 284 ballpark, how many of those are in the project area?
Again, I don't know exactly how many are in the project area. Historic ballpark, probably 10, 12.
But you don't know that for sure.
I don't know exactly, no.
Okay. And when we talk about historical nests, how far back are we going?
Yeah, that's a good question. As far as I know, the record includes anything that's been located or detected since WDFW has been tracking these birds. I don't know that a historic nest site ever gets dropped out of the database.
So basically going back forever.
Well, decades, yes.
Okay. Do you know what percentage of the historical nests in Washington State have never had any documented ferruginous hawk activity at all?
No, a question for Mr. Watson, I believe. I don't know.
And would your answer be the same if I asked you about historical nests in the project area?
Yes, it would be the
Okay.
same.
Is when you're talking about this 2-mile buffer for historical nests, is there a cutoff date that we're looking at?
This harkens back to the comment I made earlier about examining some of these historic nest sites that are in close proximity to development, because I do think there is a rational conversation about what could constitute a historic nest territory that has some probability of being reoccupied again in the future. And I think that there could be a process for identifying some of these historic sites and coming to an agreement that their likelihood of reuse would be slim or none.
So, I think I like where you're heading here. Not that you care whether I like it or not, but we're talking about we're going back to this sort of data-based nuanced approach. Am I right?
Yes, yes, we are.
Okay. And would you agree to me that, well, should the buffer apply to nests where activity has never ever been documented?
But potentially, yes.
Okay. You listed in your let me just make sure I know which one. In your supplemental testimony, you listed the materials that you reviewed before submitting that testimony, right?
Yes.
Did you review the draft guidance that's currently under consideration at WDFW?
No, I did not.
Why not?
I don't believe I have access to that. I have not seen it as far as I know.
Okay. Are you aware of any other instance in where WDFW adopted a no new infrastructure policy to the historic location of a species?
I'm not aware of any, no.
Okay, and that includes endangered species, right?
Correct.
On page, we're nearly there. On page 4 of your supplemental testimony, you're advocating for monitoring beyond the industry standard of 2 years, right?
Specific to the ferruginous hawk, yes.
That was going to be my next question. And you're talking here about post-construction fatality monitoring, right?
That's correct.
Are you aware that in addition to that 2-year monitoring, post-construction fatality monitoring, the applicant has committed to a 5-year post-construction nest monitoring?
I am aware of that. I think that's an excellent proposal.
And in fact, you specifically reference adaptive management context. What does that mean?
Adaptive management is being responsive to the conditions recorded or detected on the landscape. So there's an opportunity to learn as one collects data and apply that new evolving body of knowledge to change management approach to adapt to the situation.
And this
So
would be, sorry.
No, please cut me off. I was done.
This would be specifically, we're talking about post-construction operational data.
Yes, that's correct.
Are you talking really about a technical advisory committee?
That they would be an integral part of this, yes.
And do you know whether a technical advisory committee is planned for this facility?
Yes, it is planned.
And you don't really need to turn to this unless you want to, but on page 5 of your original testimony, you also advocated for monitoring bat fatalities, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Mr. Examiner, may I be heard on an objection, please?
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Rambrou.
Yesterday, I was questioning Mr. Guthrie or Ms. Guthrie, and you cut me off, and you did allow some extra time. I understand, but you maybe adhere to the amounts of cross-examination that were found in our schedule. Ms. Perlmutter has greatly exceeded the 0.5 hours that I see in the schedule for her. So I do think that the restrictions on cross-examination and time should be equally applied.
Your Honor, if I may.
No, I was going to interrupt you shortly anyhow, because Mr. Rambrou and I seem to be correct on monitoring the stopwatch. But since you said a few minutes ago we're almost there, I refrained from unmuting and was going to allow you to wrap up with the 1 or 2 questions.
I'm about to wrap up. I will note, with all respect to Mr. McIver, he tends to respond in narratives. I'm very, very close.
Let's not blame it on anybody. We're almost there. Ask the last couple questions, please.
Okay. A technical advisory committee can address both bats and ferruginous hawks, right?
Yes.
It can recommend more than 2 years of post-construction fatality monitoring, right?
Yes.
Curtailment doesn't happen by definition until a project is in operation, right?
Yes.
And you would agree that curtailment decisions should be data-driven?
Yes.
So you're not saying, well, it doesn't make sense to predetermine what a curtailment strategy should be, correct?
That's correct.
That goes to the technical advisory committee.
Yes.
I have no further questions.
Ms. Volkers, can you give me an estimate of your questions for Mr. McIver, how long you anticipate, even allowing for long narrative answers?
Thank you, Your Honor. I had only planned on a few questions, but given the last hour, I think I would safe to say I have at least 15 to 20 minutes of questions for Mr. McIver.
All right, what I would propose is that we take a break now till 10:30, come back with your questions. And from there, Ms. Reineveld, any redirect you would have, and then we'll go to the council members. And Mr. Rambrou, it appears that Flight 82 has arrived. So you might check with Mr. Simon as he deplanes. We'll take a break till 10:30. Thank you. All right, it looks like we're all back. It's 10:30, and we're going to go on with Ms. Volkers. cross-exam testimony here for Mr. MacGyver, and I saw, Ms. Volkers, that you may be having a cross-exam exhibit, and I think it's all ready to share either by you or Ms. Massengale, depending. Mr. MacGyver, meet Shona Volkers.
Good morning, Ms. Volkers.
Good morning, Mr. MacGyver. I cannot see anyone at the right this moment. Can you see me?
I can see you.
Okay. Oh, great. There you are. Thanks for your patience. Good morning. I represent Yakima Nation in this proceeding. And I'm sure if you've watched earlier days, I've asked questions of applicants biologists. So I have some questions for you that I wanted you to have the opportunity to answer, and that I've also tried to ask of them. And then I have some follow-up questions to Ms. Perlmutter's cross-examination. So if we could start with the term of art, best available science, can you, I know everyone has a little bit of a different take on it in the scientific world, but could you put it in your own words, please, how you understand that phrase?
Sure. Typically in the world of science, we recognize a hierarchy of available information, science on a particular topic. And it's generally recognized that a paper or information being disseminated that has gone through an external peer review is the gold standard for best available science. However, not all information, data, findings generated in the world of research and science goes through a peer review or is even appropriate for dissemination in a peer-reviewed journal or outlet. So there is another tier of information which is disseminated typically in the form of reports that might come from an agency or organization. Those documents may go through some form of internal review, call it peer review, but it's generally recognized that that form of review can be less rigorous than an external peer review. So in the absence of peer-reviewed scientific literature, that gray literature, the body of gray literature can be the best available science.
And in your experience, when WDFW publishes formal guidelines, meaning something like the Priority Habitat Species Guidelines from 2004, are those generally considered to reflect or be consistent with best available science at the time?
Yes, I would say that's an accurate statement.
Do you consider the 2004 Priority Habitat Species Guidelines from WFW to reflect current best available science?
No, I do not.
And I have the same question for the 2009 wind turbine guidelines. Do those reflect current best available science specific to, well, you were shaking your head, so
No,
in general.
Right, so I didn't mean to cut you off, but no, in general, I would say they do not reflect the current state of knowledge on this topic.
And where I was going with that was specific to ferruginous hawks. Would it certainly be fair to agree then that they do not reflect best available science?
I would agree with that. Yes, that there's more current information available.
Okay. There have been discussions by multiple biologists, including yourself this morning, about the wisdom in using perfectly concentric 2-mile offset or exclusionary zones when citing specific turbines. And I apologize if my dogs in the background are coming through. So we've talked about whether or not it should be a perfect circle. But we know from Mr. Watson's deposition that he himself has been studying the Horse Heaven Hills specifically for decades, given their importance to the ferruginous hawks, correct?
That's my understanding.
before this project was ever proposed.
You're right. That's my understanding, yes.
Do you understand then WFW's 2-mile exclusionary zone recommendation to be a compromise, given WFW's goal of getting the Fruginous hawk off of the endangered list?
That's my understanding. As it focuses on the core areas that the birds use, but does not encompass their entire home range. So in that sense, it would be something of a compromise.
Because the actual home ranges have been demonstrated in recent peer-reviewed literature to be quite a lot larger, correct?
Correct. That's my understanding of Mr. Watson's findings, was that they are larger in this region than in other parts of their the bird's range.
And what is your understanding about why that is?
It's probably a reflection of prey availability. That's what's likely to drive the movement of the birds, is the search for prey. So we know that prey in Washington is not as robust as it should be. And so they're probably having to range further and wider to get adequate prey to raise their young.
So understand that 2-mile circular exclusion zone isn't a perfect match, perhaps, with the exact topography of each of, I believe it was 16 territories identified in the project area by WFW. Could we still consider, though, the bare minimum of avoidance necessary for WFW to pursue recovery of this endangered species based upon best available science?
Well, I think it's a reasonable assertion. Yeah, I think it's reasonable.
And you used the term biological reality earlier this morning, and I didn't catch exactly how it was used. But is it fair to say that many, if not all, species listed as endangered, at least on the state endangered list, got to that position due to multiple factors, such as habitat loss, direct mortality, or loss of prey?
Sure, I think that's a reasonable statement.
So that the hawk is not unique in that it's facing different variety of factors in surviving.
Correct. No, it's not unique.
And is any entity beside WDFW responsible for determining how best to recover endangered species in the state of Washington?
State endangered is the responsibility of WDFW, which is not to say that they don't act in partnership with other entities, but it is ultimately their responsibility. Making the distinction, because if it's a species with federal status, then there's another entity that's engaged. But yes, for state level, it would be WDFW.
And the Fruginous hawk is only state listed, correct?
That's correct. Yes, that's correct.
There is some discussion with Ms. Perlmutter about occupied or active nests versus historic nests. And trying to understand what I learned from Mr. Watson. Of course, he could speak to this better, but my understanding is that there could be multiple nest sites within one identified territory, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And active or occupied is just referring to the nest that's being used by a specific breeding pair in one season.
Yes, that's my understanding as well.
So if an understanding, again, based upon his research, that they are, Fruginous hawks have a high fidelity, meaning they return to the same general area as a breeding pair each year, that doesn't necessarily mean that they return to the same nest, correct?
Not necessarily. Yes, that's correct.
And so could that help explain why we see maybe unoccupied or historic? How do you understand the term historic nest site to be used, actually? Can we start there?
Well, my understanding of the term is that it refers to a nest that was built and occupied at one time by a ferruginous hawk and is no longer active or occupied.
So we're not necessarily drawing a line, for example, let's say like everything a decade older is historic and everything a decade newer is active. We're really just talking about this season versus all previous breeding seasons. Is that fair to say?
Well, we may be heading into a level of detail that exceeds the limits of my knowledge. Mr. Watson would, of course, be able to address that better than I. I'm not aware if there's a 1 year, 2 year, 5 year distinction that's made between active and historic.
You did see in his deposition testimony, though, how he declines to focus on necessarily what's occupied this year and instead focuses on identified territories that maybe include multiple nest sites.
Yes, I did see that.
You talked earlier about perhaps in order to make more site-specific determinations of how appropriate a 2-mile exclusionary zone would be. I'm not trying to put your words in your mouth. I'm just trying to capture where we were in that conversation. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you talked about the wisdom in having WFW be further engaged in looking at specific sites and whether or not they were still viable for reoccupation.
Yeah.
And you understand from Mr. Watson's testimony that he did talk about WFW's concern in preserving historic territories for our reoccupation, correct?
Yes, correct.
Do you know if Mr. Watson or anyone else at WFW has been able to have a conversation with the applicant about specific site conditions and specific turbine locations in terms of which historical territories could be reoccupied?
I'm not aware of whether those conversations have taken place or not. Just at least some of the exchanges between the applicant and WDFW are merely cited as personal communications, and therefore their exact content is not accessible to me. So yeah, I could not characterize those conversations.
Okay, so you don't know one way or the other if any of those, I mean, right, there's a summary in the mitigation plan, but is it fair to say that we don't know as we sit here whether or not the applicant has just hypothetically said, show us the 20 worst turbines and we can talk about it or anything like that?
Well, I don't know. I won't say we don't know, but I don't know.
Okay, fair enough. We can move on to, I just have a few questions about artificial nest platforms. I believe you described them as a helpful experiment. So is it your opinion that we should not consider them, or that the council should not necessarily consider them as direct mitigation for any of the project's identified impacts?
I think that their opportunity for success is not certain enough that they would be viable as guaranteed mitigation. And they're not, my understanding is they're not being proposed in that context. It's an add-on. So, but yes, I would encourage the council to consider the caveats associated with artificial nest platforms in Washington state.
Based upon what you've learned through our discovery process, is it fair to say that the portions of the application authored by the applicant that attribute a position or recommendation directly to WFW should be confirmed either through direct citation or reference to WFW's own words and testimony?
I think that's probably fair to say. Yeah, I think that's fair to say. It's been, for example, very difficult. No, it's been impossible for me to track the conversation around buffer uh, sizes for ferruginous hog. I mean, I understand where we are now, but it's changed a number of times through the process. And again, because a lot of the guidance seems to have taken place through personal communication, and I've not been able to track it and trace how these changes were made. So, I mean, certainly my understanding could be enhanced by such a conversation.
And I believe you said in your mental testimony that you reviewed a number of the exhibits that were referenced during Mr. Watson's deposition and admitted during that deposition. So did you review a memo from Tetra Tech responding to WFW's 2-mile exclusionary zone recommendations?
I did. You're going to have to remind me of details, but I did read through that. Yes.
It was, well, I'm trying to wrap us up in a few minutes, so I could pull it up, but it was the memo that was objecting to any reliance upon what the applicant was calling novel research by Mr. Watson. Do you recall that memo?
I do. Generally, I do recall that. Yes.
Okay. You've read it, even if you don't remember every word? Okay.
Exactly.
Based upon your memory, though, is it consistent to say that the applicant objected to relying upon Mr. Watson's research, emerging research, because it wasn't peer reviewed or reflected in the formal WDFW guidelines?
I would say that's the drift of what I got from it. Yes. And yes, I'd say that's sort of generally characterizes it.
So in your professional opinion, as you are weighing everything in front of you, and you're looking at these older guidelines and then the new materials coming from WFW as well as the applicant, how do you, in your professional opinion, weigh the emerging and peer-reviewed research by Mr. Watson and his colleagues against the applicant's biologist's recently generated reports regarding the project area itself?
Well, I would view Mr. Watson as the expert on this topic because he has dedicated years of his career to studying this topic in this region. And because he represents the agency responsible for management of the bird, again, I think he gets a lot of deference and a lot of credibility for all of those reasons. And so I understand the source of frustration for the applicant who might feel like the goalposts are moving only because the goalposts are moving. But the information that Mr. Watson has presented us with, both through his testimony and through his published research, emerging published research, I think does reflect the best available science. Yeah.
I just have a few more questions, and I know we're up on the 20-minute mark, but if Ms. Massengale could please pull up exhibit 4015. Mr. McIver, I think you just testified earlier to Ms. Perlmeyer that you had not had a chance to review this. So I'm not going to ask you to answer questions about the specifics, but if we could look at this here on the screen, and I'll represent to you that this was provided through the discovery process by WDFW as the most updated draft at the time that was emailed to me of forthcoming updated updates to that 2004 PHS guideline document that has been authored by Mr. Watson, and I believe what he said in his deposition testimony is kind of a summary or reflects his recent research. And understand that there is a lot a lot of scientific material in front of everyone now, and understanding that these are not formally adopted. Do you think that there's still value to the council in reviewing something like this as a good summary of where we're at and where WDFW thinks we need to go in terms of recovering this endangered species?
Your Honor, I'm going to object on relevance grounds. What Mr. MacIver thinks might be, what he thinks might be helpful to the council in this instance, is not relevant.
Well,
Either
Ms. Volkers, I tend to agree. This has already been admitted as evidence, hasn't it?
Yes, it has, Your Honor. And I mean, we can take it off the screen, but I think I should still be able to ask him about his opinion about it.
Yeah, but not about his opinion about what the council should do with it. It's in evidence. They'll do what they do with it. So let's move on and just ask him about its credibility or any highlights and limit it to that.
Okay, we can go to page 3, please. Oh, yeah, we could go back up a few pages. Maybe just a little slower. Sorry. Okay. Sorry, page 4. I was wrong. So maybe a more general question. Again, I'm not trying to pin you down on the exact words here since you haven't had a chance to read it. But for someone who is not as deep into the publications of Mr. Watson or the discussions and is trying to understand this species better and what the species needs, would you, in your professional opinion, think that this is a helpful source, even if it's a draft, to help educate anyone on where we're at right now in 2023 on what the ferruginous hawk is doing and what it needs to survive?
I'm going to renew the objection, Your Honor.
Overruled. He can comment on the substance here.
Again, with the caveat that I have not seen this document, documents of this type, in my experience, are prepared with using the best available current science as the foundation for their descriptions and conclusions. So I would expect this to be a reliable source of information.
Those are my questions at this time. Thank you.
Ms. Reineveld, any follow-up for this witness before I see if council has questions?
Yes, I do have follow-up for this witness. Thank you, Your Honor. Hi, Mr. MacIver. It's good to see you again. Sarah Reineveld for the record. You were asked some questions about your responsive testimony pertaining to the 2-mile offset for wind turbine sightings within historic and active territories for ferruginous hawk. And turning to your responsive testimony, which is Exhibit 3001 on page 11, you state that the revised application proposes a 0.25-mile offset, a figure derived in consultation with WDFW, correct?
That's correct.
And you were speaking in your response to Ms. Perlmutter's questions about the management recommendations for Washington's priority species from Larson et al. Dated 2004. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. I couldn't recall the correct citation, but that is the one. Thank you.
And if you can recall, where, if anywhere in that study, does that study recommend a 0.25 wind turbine setback from occupied ferruginous hawks territories?
Yeah, I've been unable to locate that exact offset within the pages of that document. There are some similar numbers, but they're not the same number.
And considering that you've been unable to locate that specific citation, can you tell me whether it would be fair to say that you were relying on applicants' representation that the recommendation was derived in consultation with WDFW?
Your Honor, I'm going to object. This is leading. This is Ms. Reinfeld's witness.
In the interest of time, I recognize Ms. Reinfeld, you're trying to move us along. I'll note the objection, Ms. Perlmutter, and let her lead us to the end of his testimony. How about I put it that way? So Ms. Reinfeld, press on.
That's the question. I'm waiting for the witness to answer. Thank you, Your Honor.
I'm sorry, would you restate the question at the risk of
Yes,
offending others?
absolutely. So considering that 0.25 mile offset recommendation was not in those management recommendations, can you tell me whether it's fair to say that you were relying on applicants' representation, that recommendation was derived in consultation with WDFW?
Yes, as that recommendation was presented in the context of having come from the Larson et al. Document and from personal communication. So yes, I had to believe that that's where that figure came from, was personal consultation.
And just following up on Ms. Volker's line of questioning, you didn't have access to that personal communication with WDFW, is that correct?
That's correct.
You also spoke about additional information that you obtained through discovery that led to your supplemental testimony. And you referenced the discovery deposition of Raptor specialist, Mr. James Watson from WDFW. Was there additional information that you learned through discovery?
Well, certainly. And I think Mr. Ritter's testimony was also informative. I certainly learned more about the antelope and their use of the site on the landscape through discovery. I'm sure there were other things. Those are probably the major points.
Thank you. And you were asked some questions by Ms. Volkers regarding Exhibit 4015, the management recommendations for Washington priority species that are in draft form. Knowing that you haven't fully reviewed that document, in your expert opinion, can you tell me whether the fact that something hasn't been officially published but is in draft form makes it a less valid source of information for an expert like you to consider, hypothetically speaking?
No, I don't think it's less valid, particularly coming from a regulatory agency, because it's going to provide their recommended guidance for how management should proceed.
And you also stated in response to cross-examination questions that WDFW is the lead agency with expertise to manage and recover the fruginous hawk. And you stated you'd give them deference. Why is it important for experts like you to give deference to guidance or recommendation that are coming out of WDFW?
Well, simply because it is their responsibility to recover this species. They're the ones who will be staffing the effort, who will be planning it, who will be identifying goals and objectives for recovery. And so, yeah, it's on their plate. It's their responsibility. They need to get from point A to point B.
You also stated in response to a question by, I believe, Ms. Volkers, that WDFW's current recommendation to offset wind turbine sighting within 2 miles from active and historic fruginous hawk nesting territories was best available science. What's the basis of that opinion?
The basis is Mr. Watson's research on the fruginous hawk in this region. I think the 2 mile buffer is, again, based in biological reality. I think that's where I used that term earlier, and based on the core area sizes that he's measured within this particular range.
And based on that, do you think it's important for other experts, such as the applicant's experts in this matter, Mr. Jensen and Mr. Ramming to consider and incorporate the 2-mile offset recommendation in their analysis of the project?
I think it is important to consider that buffer in the design of the project, yes.
And Mr. McIver, have you had an opportunity to review the August 9th, 2023 memo to Amy Moon, which we're titling the Moon Memo, which proposes modifications to the project?
A very catchy title. Yes, I have reviewed that.
Can you tell me whether, if you have knowledge of this, the Horse Heaven project is currently modified and the Moon Memo incorporates those updated WDFW 2-mile offset recommendations?
It does not incorporate a 2-mile offset. It may around the last active nest, but it certainly does not incorporate the 2-mile buffer around historic nests.
And in your expert opinion, do you think it's important for the applicant to incorporate those updated 2-mile offset recommendations?
Again, Your Honor, this is leading.
Again, it is, but Ms. Reineveld, if you're wrapping up. Are we close?
I am trying to get through my questions as quickly as possible, Your Honor.
Right.
Yes.
Ms. Perlmutter, I'm just going to allow it because I want to move this along.
I'd just like to note for the record that that's, with all respect to both parties, that Ms. Reineveld is now effectively testifying, but I won't object again.
Well, to be consistent, as Mr. Aramburu likes, I think I've allowed plenty of friendly redirects along the way to create the record we need. So I'm not going to treat Ms. Reineveld today any differently than I've given leave to several other attorneys. Ms. Reineveld, let's keep going.
Did you get that question, Mr. McIver?
Again, at the risk of offense, please repeat it, if you would please, Ms. Reineveld.
My question was just whether, in your expert opinion, it would be important to incorporate the most current guidance from WDFW.
Yes, I do believe it would be important to incorporate the most current guidance.
And why is that?
Well, it's the best available science. It's what our current understanding of the ferruginous hawk reflects.
Thank you. And speaking just about the ferruginous hawk and the Moon Memo more generally, in addition to that specific avoidance recommendation, knowing that this is a new document in the context of the adjudication that isn't reflected in your testimony, do you think that those modifications in the Moon Memo more generally sufficiently either avoid or mitigate the impacts to the ferruginous hawk?
My sense of it at this point is that it does not adequately avoid potential impacts because of not incorporating the 2-mile buffer around historic nest sites.
Thank you. You were asked some questions about the effectiveness of artificial nest platforms, and I just wanted to turn you to Appendix L of the revised application. And I believe it's page 24 that concludes that successful nesting has occurred at nesting platforms throughout Eastern Washington that were installed by WDFW and the Washington Department of Transportation to enhance nesting opportunities. What support does that application provide for that statement that successful nesting has occurred at nesting platforms throughout Eastern Washington?
I think the citation led back to the WDFW publication, the recent, I think, 2022 status review of the ferruginous hawk. And I went through that document, and there is a paragraph in there describing the use of artificial nest platforms in the state of Washington. And I think it documents since the late 80s the installation of about 85 platforms. But only the most recent effort, which I think was 2019, when I think 29 platforms were installed only that one effort, is there any report of nest use? And I think I alluded to this earlier this morning. 2 of those 29 platforms were utilized. So the fate of the other, as Mr. Ramick stated, I don't like to do math in public. So the other platforms outside of the 29 we're talking about, their fate and their use was not reported in that document. So I don't know if the, WDFW performs nest surveys periodically. I don't know if those platforms are incorporated in the wider surveys, but it would be very good to know what the use rate has been for those 85 platforms in total.
So knowing that gap in knowledge, then, in your opinion, does that statement accurately characterize the nesting that has occurred at nesting platforms in Eastern Washington?
I could not have come to the same conclusion. No, I think it's much more ambiguous.
Thank you. Just because there's been a lot of testimony on this issue, but stepping back and considering kind of the ambiguities in the research, what is your opinion as to whether the installation of artificial nesting platforms has been proven effective?
In Washington, I don't have any evidence that they have been proven effective. They've been installed. There's some evidence of use, but I just think there's too much information lacking in the public arena. I would hope that WDFW would have data on these platforms in their use, but I have not seen it.
Thank you. You were asked some questions about bats and whether the project accurately quantifies bats and also mitigation measures. Do you think the project as currently designed as represented in the Moon Memo sufficiently avoids or mitigates impacts to bats such as the horay or silver-haired bats?
I do. The project will not be without impacts, and no one has represented it in that way. But I think with the TAC in place and with the monitoring and with the recognition of the fact that there are tools at hand to help in an adaptive management context address bat mortalities, I think, yes, it does address my concerns.
Thank you. And I'm almost done with my questioning or redirect, but just have a couple more questions about the pronghorn antelope. It's my understanding you were asked about whether the project appropriately quantifies the impact on the pronghorn. And in your direct testimony, you mentioned the Yakama Nation's data and kind of answered the question of whether it was incorporated into the revised application. And I just wanted to clarify for the record, in considering impacts on pronghorn antelope, do you think it would be important to incorporate that data into the revised application?
Yes, now knowing of its existence, it would be important to incorporate it.
And why is that?
Well, in earlier versions of the application and the EIS, the GPS tracking data were not available. And now that they have come to light and have been made available, it's adding to our body of knowledge and our understanding of how antelope may be utilizing this landscape. So just to give us a complete picture and a complete understanding, I don't think you can ignore that body of data.
Mr. McIver, do you believe that you were able to fully answer all the questions that were posed by council, or would you like to clarify any of your responses?
We've got the memo that I pontificated quite a bit. So I think my answers are sufficient. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. McIver, for your testimony. I don't have any further questions for you at this time.
All right, I'm going to turn to the council now. Chair Drew, council members, let's put the hands up again to get in line to ask questions of Mr. McIver. Chair Drew, I have you first, and Mr. Livingston, I'll come to you next.
Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you, Mr. McIver. I appreciate your pontificating. I learned a lot, so I really appreciate it. So one of my questions is, the ferruginous hawk is endangered. And, you know, in my limited history, I'm not a scientist. I'll admit that publicly. But there have been different endangered species that have recovered, the eagle, bald eagle particularly. But in this case, what would be the impact if there was one single bird strike on a ferruginous hawk?
Good morning, Chair Drew. Thank you. A very thoughtful question. This gets to the concept of risk. And depending on one's field, risk is defined in different ways. But in the world of biology, it's basically the probability of an event occurring multiplied by the magnitude of that event. So the surveys that have been conducted on this project site indicate relatively low use by ferruginous hawks. They're there, they've been there this year, but not very frequent use. Therefore, I think it's a reasonable conclusion that the probability of a strike is low. The problem is, with 34 breeding pairs in the state, the magnitude of such an event is high. So I think that's where we have a challenge in front of us. If you lose one bird, you've lost, again, I'm trying to avoid math in public, but roughly say 2% of your population.
Because of course that one bird represents the ability with another bird to create a third bird.
That's where I was going next. Yes, you've lost not only an individual, but probably a breeding opportunity for this season. So yes, that's the challenge.
Thank you. And then when in talking about different ways to consider managing that option, certainly we've heard a lot about the amount of buffer. I also heard you talk about the encroachment in shrub step by the housing development allowed by Benton County. So that certainly is a risk, especially as it comes close to the nesting sites near this site. So, but that's not a risk we manage. That's a risk only the county can manage. So then in considering future options, I know you also talked about curtailment, but again, if the curtailment stops the turbine after the fatality of a bird, then we haven't managed that risk. I also see that I just was looking at your exhibit, your revised testimony 3001, that actually what I see you saying there is that a type of option would be to curtail specific tower operations should a nesting pair choose to have a project site in that home range. Do you see that as, and again, this is, should the project be developed, obviously we would have a technical advisory committee, which unlike other types of developments would not stop with the operator, since we oversee at FSEC, the council oversees the decisions made, not the applicant, not the project developer. So how do you see that type of risk in this type of scenario?
Well, these are all steps that are made in an effort to stack the odds in favor of the ferruginous hawk. none of them would be guaranteed to eliminate the risk. And again, no one has suggested that, but that's the problem. So taking a step like a seasonal or a curtailment during daylight hours when the bird is actively foraging, all of those could be helpful measures in reducing risk. Countering that is the fact that these birds have very large home ranges, as we've discussed, and will not confine their movements to the 2-mile buffer that we artificially designate. So what I was suggesting in that testimony was that there could be a situation where a nesting pair's activity was predominantly along, say, the western edge, which I think is where they've more commonly been seen in recent years. And there might be some opportunity to reduce risk in that region. But again, you would not eliminate risk entirely.
Okay, thank you. You've been very helpful and have left us with a very complicated situation to walk through. Thank you.
I have, yes, thank you, Chair Drew.
Mr. Livingston, if you'll introduce yourself to Mr. McIver, assuming you don't already know him, and ask your questions.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'm Mr. McIver. I'm Mike Livingston, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and representing the department on FSEC here. So I really appreciate the discussion, the dialogue that's going on today. I mentioned a couple days ago the airtime that some of these less known species are getting through this hearing has been really valuable, I think, for everybody to become aware of some of our imperiled species. The legislature just invested $23 million in the Department for Biodiversity Conservation, and this is one of those species that we're going to be focusing on. We're going to have a new biologist in the Tri-Cities soon who's going to be able to focus on this work. We've been way behind in our efforts to be able to do that. But before we get to Ferruginous hawks, just one thing that we haven't discussed, and I think it's important to understand, is can you explain how bats are affected by turbines and what in that interaction kills the bats?
Good morning, Mr. Livingston. Thank you for a challenging question. There isn't an easy answer to that because there's been a number of mechanisms over the years which have been identified, and two of the principal ones are direct strike from encountering moving rotors. Another one, which I think has somewhat moderated as a source, relates to barotrauma. So there would appear to be a pressure differential set up by the rotating blades, and dead bats have been recovered which show signs of barotrauma. So they seem to encounter this pressure differential, and it causes fatal internal damage. Very strange. There also is some evidence that some species of bats are actually attracted to the rotors, and no one, I think, quite understands why that is, whether it concentrates insects or gives off some ultrasonic signal that the rest of us can't hear. We just don't know. It's quite an odd thing. But anyway, I suspect that most of the mortalities occur from direct strikes during foraging attempts by the bats.
Thank you. Felt like that one. Years ago, I was more familiar with that understanding, but I haven't kept up with the science to see if we've learned any more. So I appreciate that. Just quickly, regarding the platforms for ferruginous hawks, the artificial nets platforms, 11 years ago, from 2003 to 2012, I was the district wildlife biologist in the Tri-Cities. my responsibility was to keep track of ferruginous hawks in Benton and Franklin counties. And we had several platforms. Almost all of them were not used. There were some. They do still hold some promise, I think. It's really dependent upon the territory and are there alternative nesting options? I mean, cliffs, the lone trees, the black locust trees that are out there, those are really the preferred nesting platform. But just wanted to get that out there that they are they are a tool. They're not a panacea, I think you mentioned. I would agree with that. So regarding these buffers that we've been talking about, rarely do we have complete data to, define individual pairs territory. That would require a lot of intense study on those individuals. But in the absence of having that type of data to define a territory, would you agree that adding some form of a uniform buffer around a nesting territory may be the best we can implement in the absence of having the data?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I would agree with that statement. Yeah.
Yeah, and well, I did the math. So 10 kilometers, which is what the ideal buffer would be, equates to 6.2 miles. And what Mr. Watson has recommended is 2 miles, which is about a third of the ideal. Just wanted to put that in there. So I wanted to talk about, we haven't talked about the longevity of ferruginous hawks. Do you know how long their lifespan is?
I have read. I think 20 years would be quite an old bird. I think it's more typically in the range of 5 to 6 years.
Can you describe the impact of adding new sources of mortality to an endangered species that's in steep decline, especially for those that are, longer lived than, 1 or 2 years?
Yeah, it's mortality, when a population becomes as small as this one, mortality is generally viewed as being additive. So on top of everything else the bird is already experiencing, here's this new mortality event. And so it becomes a greater event, an event of greater consequence because it's additive on a small population. I'm starting to lose focus. Please let me know if that didn't answer your question.
No, I think it did. It did. So I'm just trying to put into context. So some of the post-construction monitoring elsewhere has, I can't remember if it's Washington and Oregon, but there was up to 8 mortalities that have been detected due to direct, collision with wind turbines for ferruginous hawks. And so I'm trying to put in perspective that, and hopefully you can help me, with a species that's low in numbers, lives fairly long, how does, that number of 8 mortalities contribute to population declines?
Yeah, I can't say specifically. I think what's maybe interesting in the context of your question is Mr. Jansen's paper, which I think came out last year, in which he did some population viability analysis on the ferruginous hawk. And I have some concerns about the way that was done that we don't need to get into. I think the take-home message from that, which is valid, is that this population is in trouble and cannot bear a lot more mortality. So, yeah, I think the consequences of loss are high and difficult to mitigate.
Okay. Something we also haven't talked about too much is predation. And particularly eggs, young, can be a real problem for a struggling population. Would you agree?
I agree, and I think that some of WDFW's research on the population has specifically identified a bottleneck at the juvenile stage. So getting birds into the adult population and breeding is problematic with this group.
Are you familiar with common ravens and great horned owls and their population numbers these days?
Well, they are both species that are adapted to human presence and human disturbance. And yes, this has long been an issue through my career as I have moved around the Great Basin and then now up into Washington. Both common raven and great horned owl are significant, often significant problems, a significant source of mortality on nests and nestlings.
And so you mentioned in human development. So would this project as described as proposed currently potentially add to increases in raven and great horned owl numbers?
Yes, but I would say the applicant has made an effort to minimize things like overhead power lines, which give ravens a perch site to hunt from. But unquestionably, there would be more opportunities for those species as a result of the project.
Yeah, certainly something that we'd need to manage going forward in a way to not augment their populations if possible.
Agreed.
So I'm wrapping up here. I'm pretty close. So with a declining endangered species like we have here, would you agree that we need to exercise as much caution as possible, unlike we would with a more common species like red-tailed hawk?
I'd say that's warranted, yes.
And here's my punchline in Ferruginous hawks is, so could this project as designed contribute to continued decline of Ferruginous hawks in Washington state?
I would say it certainly could. I'd say there's a lot of thought and a lot of effort going into identifying minimization techniques and mitigation. But unquestionably it could, and that does need to be balanced against the fact that this project will address, to however small a degree, climate change, which is also impacting the bird. You have a difficult task in front of you.
Appreciate the recognition of that, and I appreciated the response to Chair Drew about managing risk in all of its forms that we're trying to do here. So I'm done. So I really appreciate your time, Mr. McIver.
And yours, Mr. Livingston. Thank you.
All right, Mr. McIver, I'm going to introduce Stacy Brewster from the Utilities Transportation Council. She has some questions for you.
Hello, Mr. McIver. I appreciate all the in-depth conversation we've had about Ferruginous hawks, bats, and pronghorn. One thing we haven't talked about in your testimony was the impacts on general avian populations. That's a concern that's come up quite a bit in public comments that we've received. In your testimony, you mentioned that the project will have disproportionate, excuse me. You don't expect the impact to be disproportionate. Can you talk a little bit about what the expected impact is?
Well, yeah, wind energy projects always impact birds. I mean, we've come to learn and understand that that's one of the trade-offs that we accept in implementing these projects. We currently accept. I think there's a lot of research ongoing into how to minimize these impacts. The application indicates, and I would concur, that the species that would ordinarily be at greatest risk. And again, let's exclude ferruginous hawk from this discussion. The other species that would be at great risk have behaviors in the context of the project that either all but eliminate risk, or it certainly minimize the likelihood that they would be mortalities as a result of the project. This project is expected to impact primarily horned lark, which is a common bird in the open grasslands and even reasonably adapted to farmed lands, quite common out on the Columbia Plateau, for example. And that's the species that most frequently shows up in post-construction mortality surveys. So I don't have any reason to believe that this project would be any different from those others. So there would be mortality events, but they would tend to fall on species that are that have robust populations that very likely could absorb these sorts of mortalities.
Thanks. I know there's been a lot in the comments regarding sandhill cranes and snow geese moving through the area. So what I'm hearing is those populations are robust enough to withstand some mortality. Is that correct?
Yeah, and for whatever reason, I studied sandhill cranes for my master's degree. So they hold a place for me. For whatever reason, they seem to be at very low mortality risk with wind energy facilities. And in this particular project, they don't seem to be utilizing the habitat in the immediate area, certainly not for breeding. I don't think there would be suitable breeding habitat there, nor is that really part of the breeding range. But it would be during stopovers in migration, and they seem to be attracted to other areas for stopovers. So yeah, what's been documented is high flyovers, and that should put them out of the rotor swept range, and yeah, should be very low risk.
Thank you.
Hey, you're welcome. Thanks for the questions.
Mr. Levitt. You're on mute, Mr. Levitt.
Sorry.
There you go.
Hello, Mr. McIver. I'm Eli Levitt, Ecology's Department of Ecology's council member to FSEC. I guess just at a very high level, there's this concept of leave no trace, but what if we kind of change that just for a moment to, let's try to do better? Are there, assuming you had some substantial funds and resources, are there restoration activities that could take place in the greater lease area that would provide any benefit to all of the species we've talked about? So I'm putting aside things like the artificial nests and the 2-mile radius for the hawks, but planting of native species, removal of invasive species, maybe some sort of very small rotating fire regimen, anything along those lines that would have a potential positive impact.
Good morning, Mr. Levitt. You saved the tough question for last, I guess. Yes, I think given the degradation in shrub steppe habitat that's occurred in the state over the last century and a half, I think there is a significant need to look at habitat restoration efforts. I'm not familiar enough with the area to say that there's a specific site, but I think it's an opportunity worth looking for. I think there's two challenges here. One is scale, because the extent of the loss or degradation of shrub steppe habitat is so enormous that it it's almost hard to know where to even start, but start we probably should. And then the other thing I would say about it is that shrub steppe habitat has proved to be a very difficult habitat type to restore. And I believe there was allusion in maybe Mr. Ritter, maybe Mr. Watson's testimony about in future recommendations, thinking about function of these habitat types. And I think that's something that's been often absent from our discussions about how do we not just create a landscape that looks right to us, but actually functions closer to the fashion of the habitat that's been lost or is being disturbed. So yes, it's certainly worth consideration.
Okay, thank you. That was my only question.
Thank you.
All right, and the last council member with a hand up is Lenny Young, Department of Natural Resources.
Good morning, Mr. McIver. I'm Lenny Young, and I serve as DNR's representative to FSEC. I'd like to follow up on one of Mr. Livingston's questions. Would you support lethal control of ravens and great horned owls as part of mitigation for this project? And if so, how do you think that should be accomplished?
Your Honor, are you sure we're not out of time? Good morning, Mr. Young.
Well, Mr. Young's never quoted Edgar Allan Poe to this point, but we'll go there.
Quite a loaded question, Mr. Young.
Might I say no pun intended? I think
Yeah.
we're getting a little silly today.
Yes, I thank you. I was going to sidestep that. Thank you. I am very hesitant to recommend lethal removal. I have been involved with other projects and conservation efforts looking at species that are in a very challenging position, like sage grouse, for example, which also suffer from predation from ravens. And the managing agencies wanted to go to lethal control. And it probably has its place, but I see in this instance, it's a last resort, because really the heart of what the problem is lack of habitat and degraded habitat. And it's just so easy to do the blame the predators game and take out our shortcomings collectively, our shortcomings as land stewards on the predators. So that said, in something like the nest platform situation, I think there's a valid question on the table of monitoring those. And if you encountered ravens using the platform or great horned owls, should those nests be removed and an opportunity created for ferruginous hawk to take them over? I think that's a question that's on the table. I'm not in a position to answer it.
Thank you.
Chair Drew, council members, any additional questions for Mr. McIver? All right, not seeing any. Ms. Reinebeld, did this cause any need for further redirect?
I don't have need for further redirect in response to the council's questions. Thank you, council.
Ms. Perlmutter, I'll come to you, and then Ms. Volkers to see if there's any additional questions you might have for this witness before we let him go.
I do, Your Honor. And thanks so much for Mr. McIver for your testimony. A lot of this has been extremely illuminative. And I'm going to try and work backwards and do this as efficiently as I can. You just testified in response to Mr. Young, to Councilmember Young, that there was an open question that perhaps if on the monitoring artificial nest platforms, if we were to encounter, for example, ravens using the platform or owls using the platform, that there are ways that might be under consideration for addressing that further prey risk to ferruginous hawks. Am I right?
Yes, that's correct. And with the caveat added that, at least in terms of the owl, they have some protection under our laws. So
All I'm asking really is that there's some things that can be done. In other
yes,
words, this is a dynamic situation.
yes, correct.
Okay. And it was interesting to me. You just talked about again with in response to Council Member Young. You said that there was a situation with regard to a species like sage grouse where the managing agencies wanted to go to lethal control, and you had some qualms about that, right?
Yes, that's true.
And so what I'm taking from that, again, at the 72,000 foot level, is that just because a managing agency says something, that doesn't necessarily mean that ultimately that reasonable minds can differ with managing agencies as to what the appropriate measures are for protecting a species.
That's true. There's always room for discussion.
You also testified, now I'm going way back to the beginning of your testimony, or the beginning of your cross by Ms. Volkers. You said that the ferruginous hawk's prey in Washington is not as robust as it should be. Do you remember saying that?
I do.
And you've also indicated, though, we talked about it earlier, that things like planting additional native grasses at the solar arrays could, in fact, enhance those prey populations. Am I right?
It's possible.
Okay. And you testified, there's been a lot of talk about artificial nest platforms. And I am jumping around here, but you testified that that the artificial nest platforms are not being proposed as mitigation, that they're considered an add-on. Am I right?
That's my understanding. Yes.
And would you agree with me that that uh the applicant is actually doing lots of things, has made a number of suggestions to go above and beyond in order to, I don't want to use the word mitigation because that's obviously a term of art, but the applicant's made a lot of suggestions and proposals and offers that would enhance species and wildlife protections at the site.
They are working very hard to accommodate our concerns.
Um, Thank you. You also indicated that you would see Mr. Watson as the expert on the topic of ferruginous hawks. Can I just assume that you are not disparaging either Mr. Jansen or Mr. Ramig's conclusions as well? I mean, these are
No,
three
no.
scientists.
Yes, yes, yes.
Um,
No, correct. I'm not disparaging those fellows.
and as you testified a moment ago, professional scientists may have disagreements about ways to go on a particular issue.
Certainly.
Okay. And in response to Ms. Reineveld's questioning, you said in your testimony, and this is with regard to your initial testimony, that you expected uh, the you expected there would be a 0.25 offset recommended, right?
That's initially what I encountered. Yes.
Okay. And you testified, you signed that under penalty of perjury, right?
Right.
That was true to the best of your knowledge and belief at the time.
At that time, yes.
Okay. With regard to this draft exhibit that was put up as exhibit 4015, and that's the August 9th draft of the guidelines. And you testified that you don't think that draft is any less valid because it's in draft form, right?
Uh, yes, correct.
Um, but a draft by definition can change, can't it?
Yes,
That draft hasn't been finalized.
that's correct.
And in
My
fact,
understanding.
sorry, I'm doing it
Yeah.
again, Mr. MacGyver. And again, that draft was based on, I believe it's a 2014 study, isn't that right?
I can't answer that. I'm sorry. I don't know if it is.
Okay. But certainly as a draft, it's subject to change.
Certainly, yes.
And there's no way to know at this point where those changes are headed.
No.
Yes, there's no way to know where those changes are headed.
Yes, there's no way to know where those changes are headed.
And you stated that 2 miles, that the 2 mile proposed buffer, that's currently best available science.
Yes, I would say it is.
But that's not actually really true, is it? There are competing reputable data-based recommendations that are being made by the applicant, but competing reputable recommendations, right?
Objective, argumentative.
Mr. McIver, do you feel she's arguing with you?
Yes.
I do too, so I'm going to sustain the objection. Ms. Perlmutter, let's just make our points as to what is or isn't within the realm of his expertise and move along.
Would you agree with me that there are differing viewpoints as to what that buffer should be?
Yes.
And in fact, your testimony earlier this morning and in your both your original and supplemental testimony was that the buffer, that a one size fits all, strike that, that a buffer should be based on the available data specific to this project. Am I right?
Ideally, that's correct. There may not be adequate data to directly address the question. So we have to use the best that's available. Yes.
Okay. In response to Chair Drew's questions, you said that there might be an opportunity, and she was asking you, again, a very interesting answer about what risk means at your particular scientific field. And she said that that there might be an opportunity to reduce risk in the region. And I think you were talking about the project area, but you couldn't eliminate it altogether, right?
Correct.
And isn't that it? Not as an argument, this is a real question. Isn't that what a technical advisory committee is meant to do?
Yes.
You testified, let me see who you were answering, to Mr. Livingston, to Councilmember Livingston, that based on some construction monitoring elsewhere, you're aware of up to 8 mortalities that were and ferruginous hawks detected due to direct collisions with wind turbines.
That's my recollection from the literature. Yes.
And that's not specifically Washington State, right? That's the Columbia River Basin generally.
Right. Washington State specifically is 4, is my understanding. 4 mortalities.
And that's over the last 25 years, roughly.
Roughly, yes.
Okay. And you said that this is the take-home message was that this population is in trouble and can't bear a lot more mortality. Do you remember saying that?
I do, yes.
But you'll agree with me. We've talked about any number of other mortality threats to the ferruginous hawk population, right?
Yes, there are many.
Okay. Would you consider climate change or this project to constitute the greater risk to the ferruginous hawk?
Boy, I don't know that I can answer that question. It's a very thought-provoking question.
That's what makes us. Go ahead.
No, I'm fumbling. I don't think I can answer that. Very good question.
I have nothing further.
All right, Ms. Volkers, anything, last questions for this witness? All right, I'm not hearing Ms. Volkers, but I see Mr. Arambaru, your mic is off mute. Did you have something you wanted to say?
I would like to ask 2 questions, if I may.
Certainly. Go ahead.
Mr. MacGyver, I'm Rick Rambrew. I'm the attorney for Tri-Cities Cares, the local citizens groups, and we're very interested in the wildlife that's impacted by the project, including the hawk. The applicant has proposed two different turbine sizes and two different turbine layouts. One proposal is 244 more or less smaller turbines, and then there's a proposal for 150 larger turbines. Do the selection of the turbines have anything to do with your testimony?
Well, I think there would be consequences from either choice. My understanding is that one of the reasons for the lack of specificity in which towers would be used is it's somewhat dependent on market availability. And so having two different types of turbines also gives a range of potential impacts to be evaluated in the context of SEPA. Either alternative would result in some amount of rotor swept area. And I cannot tell you anymore because the figures are not in my head deeply enough, but one alternative is going to have a slightly larger rotor swept area than the other, and therefore potentially present more risk of collision because they're affecting a larger air parcel. From the standpoint of something like the ferruginous hawk, where we've been talking about establishing buffers, I would imagine it would be easier to fit 150 towers in the landscape and provide some buffers than it would be to install 240 towers and still provide buffers. So there's probably a biological preference to be expressed in having fewer towers. Yeah.
Okay, is that the answer?
That's my answer. I hope it answered your question.
I didn't have a particular idea in mind. And is the total swept area of interest in this regard?
It has an impact on the, let me use a different word. It has an effect on the amount of risk that birds and bats would be exposed to.
Okay, one last question, and this is my third one, and I apologize. I'm putting on the screen. Can you see, Ms. Ivor, the photograph on the screen?
I do see the map, yes.
Okay, and do you recognize this as a map of the project site and an aerial photograph showing other areas?
I do recognize it as such, yes.
And I have heard, listening this morning to a lot of questions about individual turbines and individual sites and individual distances from turbines. Is the cumulative impact of a project that's 25 miles long? Is there a cumulative impact beyond individual impacts for a project of this size?
Certainly there is a cumulative impact, yes.
And can you characterize it or quantify it?
Well, let's narrow this down to my resource. I assume we're still talking strictly about wildlife. And I think my greatest concern in the cumulative impacts arena is with bats, because we know so little about their population sizes. And I do think that the applicant has made the effort to reduce and minimize impacts. Nonetheless, there would still be impacts on a regional population of unknown size. So it's adding, the project would add cumulatively to mortality on those bat species. And it would certainly add cumulatively to mortality on bird populations. So then at some point you ask the question of, are the cumulative impacts significant? And that's, that's where the details come in. And it's a bit of an unknown for the bats. Probably not significant for birds. As I mentioned earlier, it would appear that most of the impacted bird species have robust enough populations that they could absorb the expected degree of mortality.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McIver. I promised 2 questions. I did 3, but I want to keep within my limits. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think, Mr. Ramber, we were within the double up your questions limit, so thank you. Any other questions for Mr. McIver? All right, I see Ms. Breideveld had her hand up, and then Ms. Volkers.
Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Volkers. I can be the last questioner.
Thank you, and apologies, I did fall off or get kicked out of the meeting for the last few questions, but I think I heard what I needed to ask this question, which is I was hearing some things that I wanted to better understand because I don't know that I know quite where they are in the materials before us. So there were questions around the solar fields specifically, understand that they're fenced, and questions about planting of vegetation under the solar panels. My understanding from the deposition testimony of WFW's biologist is that actual restoration of shrub steppe habitat is incredibly difficult in the best conditions. So Mr. McIver, could you maybe explain the limitations of what you were agreeing to there in terms of what's possible to plant underneath solar panels? Trying to understand kind of where you were going with that, or what your exact opinions were on what would be actually achievable inside a solar field in terms of habitat.
It's my understanding from studies that have been conducted on other solar arrays and from the information that's available in the application that a simplified mix of grasses would be planted under the solar arrays. And by simplified, I mean relatively few species compared to what you would find in a native shrub steppe ecosystem. And those grasses are selected in part to be to not interfere with the function of the solar arrays. So there are priorities in choosing those species that go ahead of providing wildlife habitat. That said, those grasses probably would be better habitat, speaking very broadly, than dryland wheat monotype. So in that sense, they could offer better habitat to species that are tolerant of the solar arrays and occasional human incursion into those zones. We've seen, it's been documented through publications that typically the species that move into these solar arrays are adapted to human disturbance. They're sort of more generalists. We tend to lose the habitat specialists, but they're not entirely without value. But because of their structure, they would also limit a bird like, say, the ferruginous hawk would probably not forage within a solar array. It's just not the habitat they're adapted to. But other species probably would.
Okay, I appreciate the extra explanation. Makes sense to me. I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Reineveld, you will be the last. Your witness,
Yeah, I just
as you
have a
sponsored it,
few.
that's appropriate.
Okay, I just have a few clarification questions. So Ms. Perlmutter asked you a question about managing agencies and a case in which you disagreed with a recommendation of a managing agency. And you also testified in this case that you deferred to Mr. Watson and WDFW's most recent 2-mile offset recommendation. From your review, can you tell me whether you have any reason in your expert opinion to disagree with that recommendation?
I don't have any reason to disagree with it.
Thank you. And do you feel as if you were able to completely answer all the questions that were asked of you by counsel and the parties?
I do. I've said more this morning than I have in the past month. Thank you for your time, everyone.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any further questions. Thanks so much, Mr. McIver.
Mr. McIver, thank you so much for your time. I want to add to that. I think it was really enlightening. We've had some really great wildlife testimony, and this was a nice wrap to it today. Thank you, Ms. Reineveld, for producing such a good witness. Not that any of the others were equally good, but this was a nice close up on a broad brush of, I think the term was avifauna, right? And everything else. I don't know, what do you call the ones on the ground? Terrafauna?
Terrafauna, I like that. Yes.
All right, it'll work. All right, you are free to go. Thank you, sir. Ms. Perlmutter, you got 2 words tonight. Let's turn to some questions. It's right after noon. Mr. Rambrew, have you heard from Mr. Simon? I see that both planes have arrived at the end terminal within the last 2 hours.
This is Mr. Simon. I am on the phone.
Excellent, Mr. Simon. Thank you. Welcome back from Alaska.
Thanks.
If you're ready to testify now, or do you need time to talk to Mr. Aramburu before you do?
I am ready to testify now.
Mr. Aramburu, would that be appropriate to shift to Mr. Simon's testimony then?
If he's ready, I'm ready. I do want to make, as a matter of record, and do pose an objection. You're following the personal movements of Mr. Simon here with regard to air travel, that kind of thing. I've never seen that done before. I think it's at least highly unusual. So I'll just pose my objection to that.
Just doing you a favor, Mr. Rambrew. I told you if he wasn't available today, he wouldn't testify. And you made it very clear as to what flights he would be coming back from in approximate times. Trying to do you a favor. Mr. Simon, I hope I'm not invading by looking at publicly available information from Alaska Airlines and the Flight Tracker website. But I think we've established you're here. Ms. Volkers?
Thank you, Your Honor. If I just may real quick on the schedule, we didn't have much break, so I just want to note that Mr. Meninick did come to our offices in order to be available at 11. When I saw 5 council member hands go up at 11:20, we went ahead and let him go for lunch, but he was asked to come back in order to testify around 1. And so if that's now changing again, which I understand, he's back after being out for a while, and I'd like to not keep asking him to come and wait in our offices unnecessarily.
Understood. Tell him to come back at 1. I think Mr. Simon's testimony and the questions should be relatively quick.
Okay.
All right. Mr. Simon, good morning. You are Rich Simon, is that right? Or do you go by Richard?
Richard is my official name, yes.
Great. And you're calling in by phone this afternoon, right?
That's correct, yes.
All right. I don't know if you have them with you or in front of you. We have 4 different exhibits that you sponsored. Exhibit 5500, Exhibit 5501, which was the subject of an order striking some of the testimony, but there is a revised version in the record now with the appropriate redlining. Exhibit 5502 and Exhibit 5503. Mr. Aramburu, is that an accurate listing of this witness's testimony?
That's correct, and there's been strikeouts to portions of those testimonies.
I think that's limited to 5501. Perhaps there's some other minor ones in the others, but I know that Tri-Cities Cares has taken the time to resubmit subject to the striking orders, and I appreciate that. I don't know which parties might have questions for Mr. Simon. I don't have that part of the schedule in front of me. Mr. McMahon, I presume would be you, but are there any others? I'm not seeing or hearing from any others. Mr. McMahon, you do have some questions for Mr. Simon?
I do, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right. So after I have Mr. Aramburu introduce him, I'll come to you, Mr. McMahon.
Mr. Simon, you're available by phone. You have provided testimony concerning electrical issues. You've also provided some also provided testimony concerning the responses to Mr. Poulos's testimony, which was yesterday. Is that correct?
Well, I haven't seen, well, Mr. Poulos's testimony was from some time ago. You know, that was probably from a month ago. That's what I responded to.
Yes.
Yeah, Mr. Aramburu, let me swear the witness in before you start, and then we can make sure everything he does is sworn testimony and adopted today. So, Mr. Simon, I'm going to ask you wherever you might be to raise your right hand. And do you, Rich Simon, solemnly swear or affirm that all the testimony you're adopting in exhibits 5500, 5501, 5502, and 5503 as modified by the striking order, and all your answers today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do swear.
Okay, Mr. Aramburu, now you may proceed.
Okay. And the exhibits described will be admitted then?
Yes, they are, sir. As with every other witness, by him adopting them, they are admitted. Okay,
thank you. Mr. Simon, I previously went through your background here, and you indicated that you had reviewed the prior written testimony of Mr. Poulos, but you have not had an opportunity to either listen to or review Mr. Poulos's testimony from yesterday. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and you were otherwise in the state of Alaska yesterday as a part of a pre-planned trip, correct?
Correct.
Okay, Mr. Simon, Mr. McMahon, you're not on the screen. Mr. McMahon is. I understand Mr. McMahon, who is the applicant's attorney, does have some questions for you, and so he will be going ahead and asking questions, and maybe other parties will as well. So that'll be the next thing you hear on the telephone. So if you've got any questions, any problems, please interrupt and let us know. But the next voice you hear is going to be Mr. McMahon.
That's fine.
Okay. Good morning, Mr. Simon. Sorry that the next voice you have to hear is mine. That's, I suppose, the way it goes. And Your Honor, I am making some efforts to streamline this given the hour and the expectations here. So if I drag this down, you just give me a prod and make me do something different. But I do have some questions. And I also just want to preface this by saying, Mr. Simon, that Dr. Poulos did in fact testify yesterday, and I can represent that and I said this on the record yesterday, I cautioned him to stay within the bounds of areas of testimony that remain after the strike motion that Mr. Aramburu referenced. And I cautioned him to not delve into these so-called off-limit targets or topics. And he did agree to hear that. And I think that we did have a good faith response from Dr. Poulos with regard to that. So, sorry. Oh, sorry. Just giving my. Sorry, I can't find it right now, Emily. All right. So I'm just going to jump in here, Mr. Simon. And again, I appreciate your being here today. And unfortunately, I'm citing two testimony exhibits. And I understand you're on the phone, which may be a challenge, but I'm sure Mr. Aramburu can help in pulling up your testimony as needed. So, and I'm looking first at the June 12 testimony, and that's exhibit 5201 dash T. And first question is this, Mr. Mr. Simon, you state on page 3, lines 1 through 6, and Rick, if you want to pull that up, I'm not really prepared to do so, but although he's not on the phone, so we may just need to do our best.
Mr.
So,
McMahon, I have that file open on a laptop.
Great.
So
Oh, that's great.
I'm-
Good to know, Mr. Simon. Thank you. All right. You state, page 5, lines 1 through 6, that it is typical practice that, and quote here, all permits are granted for a specific turbine array plan, which includes the number and exact locations of the turbines, and that it is unprecedented, your word, for permitting agencies to issue open-ended permits for horse heaven. Do you recall that testimony?
Yes.
All right. So is it your belief that the Energy Facilities Site Evaluation Council, or FSEC henceforth, simply grants permits for a specific turbine array plan with no regulatory or environmental review?
No, that's not my understanding.
And is it your belief that FSEC would, and these are your quoted words, issue open-ended permits for horse heaven? Is that your belief?
Well, to explain what I was saying, my experience has been that generally construction starts after permits are granted and there's a notice to proceed for the construction. And from projects I've worked on over all these years, by the time you get to that point, everything is uniquely specified in all these attributes of the project I have listed in that testimony. I will say I'm not entirely sure exactly what FSEC's role in this is. I did assume that they issue some sort of final permit. If they're just issuing some sort of generic, this looks okay, then obviously what I wrote there is not appropriate to FSEC, but I don't have the knowledge.
Okay, so just to clarify then, that testimony did not actually apply to the rigors of the Washington Energy Facility Site Evaluation Council. It was more a generic observation, I gather?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And I assume that you are aware of the micrositing concept and practices for permitting wind energy facilities?
I'm not sure exactly what you were saying.
Sorry, Mr. I don't mean to interrupt you, Mr. Simon.
No, I'm not sure. Say that phrase again, and I'll have a question for you.
Yeah. Are you aware, generally in the wind energy industry, of the micrositing practice for actually the final location and evaluation of siting wind energy facilities?
I think if I understand your question right, are you saying that a permit's granted and then the developer can then change the array? Sometimes I've seen that in certain jurisdictions where there's some flexibility. For example, you can move a turbine 100 feet without reapplying. In other cases, it's very specific right down to the foot. So, there are different ways, different jurisdictions handle that issue.
Okay, that's fine. But as to FSEC, it sounds like you don't have any knowledge about that practice with FSEC.
That's correct. I don't.
Oh, okay, thank you. You mentioned, and I'm just going to skip along here to try to move along quickly here. So, so that's just what I'm going to do. So referring to your testimony again, I'm sorry if you're on a phone, but I'll just do my best. You testified, and this for Mr. Rambrew's benefit, it's page 9, lines 18 through 21, and page 10, lines 1 through 3 of his testimony. I assume that you are not privy to any discussions or efforts by Scout Clean Energy to discuss and potentially resolve any issues regarding wake modeling, particularly for Nine Canyon. I assume you're not aware of those conversations one way or the other?
That's correct. And again, I have that language up on my screen. And you're correct. I'm not aware of any such discussions.
All right, thank you. And on your rebuttal testimony, page 4, lines 1 through 5, you state, and I quote, "It is my understanding that Montana winds are currently higher priority for the Pacific Northwest investor-owned utilities than Central Washington for adding to their energy portfolio." And you go on to say, presumably, these utilities are all considering all associated project development costs, including transmission. So this is your assumption, correct?
Yes, and based on having worked with many, many utilities over the years, obviously they look at the total cost of a project. Many very limited projects have been refused because they just simply don't have transmission access or it's too expensive. So
Sure.
as far as I know, any utility, I've never seen one say, we don't care what the transmission situation is, we want to build the project. It's part of the.
Yeah, great. I appreciate that answer. And on exhibit 5503-R, I'll just pause again for Mr. Ramprou, page 3, lines 18 through 21, you state the following: "Finally, due to the unusual nature of winds in California, there are very few locations where wind turbines can be economically sited, whereas Washington is much more suitable land area." Do you recall that testimony?
Yes.
And I assume that remains your belief and testimony?
Absolutely. I mean, I am very responsible for most of the original development in California. There's only about 4 locations which are very geographically bound, with the exception of actually most of these places, an area of 5 by 10 square miles is sort of about, well, more than that, maybe 10 by 20. But whereas in Washington, many sites out in the eastern part of the state, and then on the Columbia Gorge places too. So there certainly would be many more areas with what appear to be suitable winds, because people are, in best of my knowledge, rushing to try to build wind farms in eastern Washington now. So yes, I would agree with my statement.
Okay, and so just to sum up here then, it sounds like California is particularly constrained, and I understand that you've been at this for some 40 years, so you certainly know the conditions in California far better than I. So California is constrained for additional wind energy, and you acknowledge that while Montana may be a fine place to develop because of the robust wind energy facilities, that substantial high voltage long distance transmission lines would need to be constructed and acquired over Lord knows how many years in order to implement that integration of that resource, correct?
I don't know about the cost, or the size, so I have no opinion on that. And obviously, all I was stating in the testimony was that I'm aware that from several parties that they're looking for Montana wind, not because it is windier and it's a different profile during the year.
Right. Yep, got it. I understand that. All right, Judge Torm, those are my abbreviated and accelerated answers to move things along. I have more, but I think that's all I really am looking for in this discussion with Mr. Simon. And Mr. Simon, I thank you for your time, and I appreciate the rush you made off of airplanes to attend here today, and I appreciate your testimony. Thank you.
My pleasure, Mr. McMahon.
Let me ask Mr. McMahon of the other parties if they have any questions, and then the council members, and then Mr. Ramber, I'll come back to you. I don't believe there was any planned cross-exam from Yakima Nation, Council for the Environment, or Benton County, but if there is a need for that now, please speak up. And council members, if you'll start to raise your electronic hands if you have any questions for Mr. Simon. All right, I'm not seeing any. So Mr. Aramburu, I'll let you see if there's any follow-up you'd like with Mr. Simon.
No follow-up required. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Simon, safe travels to you. Thank you very much for being here. We've got your exhibits and testimony admitted to the record. Ms. Volkers, if you would tell Mr. Meneinik 1:15, I propose that we come back at 1:15 take his testimony and then Mr. Kobus, and that should wrap up the evidentiary portion of today's hearing. Parties will then come back and talk a little bit about post-hearing briefs and get you the deadlines for those. My understanding that will be in that the transcripts per the contract that B&A litigation has with FSEC are going to come in 10 business days after each different hearing date. So they are going to be stacked and sequenced. That means you'll start seeing transcripts on a sequential basis as early as next week. So with that, we'll come back in 55 minutes at 1:15. Thank you. All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to do a quick survey to make sure it looks like everybody's back on our participants list. I think it looks that way. Ms. Volkers, do we have Jerry Maninek? You're on mute.
Thank you and apologies. Quite a week. Your Honor, I believe we do have him in Mr. Jones' office.
And I think I just saw him on the screen. Mr. Maninek, good afternoon. I'm Adam Torum. I'm the administrative law judge helping run this hearing, and I appreciate you being available today to give your testimony. Do you have any questions about the process, or has Mr. Jones made you aware?
No questions.
All right, sir. I understand you had submitted some pre-filed testimony. Exhibit 4004 is how it's been marked. And Ms. Volkers, if you can confirm that's the one exhibit, both a confidential and a redacted version.
Yes, Your Honor, that is correct.
All right, Mr. Maninek, I'm going to swear you in and have you take the oath of witness for this tribunal before the Energy Siting Council, and then you'll adopt the testimony by doing so. And Ms. Volkers will indicate whether any of the questions that you might ask or testimony you might share might need to be taken in a closed record session to preserve any confidentialities and out of respect for the tradition of the Yakama Nation and the Confederated Bands and the rest of your people. So if you'll raise your right hand. Do Jerry Maninek solemnly swear or affirm that all the testimony contained in Exhibit 4004 and any testimony you'll provide today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Ms. Volkers, if you'd please introduce Jerry Maninek to the council and the rest of the parties present today.
Thank you, Your Honor, and Siting Council. Mr. Maninek is a former chairman, an elected leader of the Yakama Nation. He's a Yakama elder, and he's currently the deputy director of the Cultural Service Program at the Yakama Nation. I'm going to ask that we go into closed session before I ask Mr. Maninek any questions.
All right, thank you, Ms. Volkers. Council members, and you know the drill here. This will be our last confidential session, I think, of the administrative proceeding. Members of the public that might not be familiar, we have some confidential and sensitive information that's being conveyed by a witness. In this case, Mr. Maninek from the Yakama Nation. We're going to move to a place where only those participants that have signed confidentiality agreements can participate out of respect for the sensitive nature of the testimony. Ms. Volkers, do we anticipate more than about 15 minutes or how long?
I would guess long, Your Honor, just based upon how long Mr. Salam's testimony went on Monday, which I believe was an hour, including council member questions. So I would ask that we stay in closed session in the same way for Mr. Maninek today so that he can feel comfortable answering those questions from the council.
All right, I'll have the council put up a slide that for staff that will be back shortly after 2 o'clock, maybe a little bit longer. That should give us what we need. They can change the time if we continue to run past 2 o'clock. So let's move into closed session. Ms. Grantham will have the machines do their magic.
Yeah.
All right, we're back in the open record session. We just heard from Jerry Maninek, a tribal elder with the Yakama Nation, and we have completed his testimony and he's been released. Parties, I think that takes us now to Dave Kobus and any very limited cross-examination that might be related to his deposition that was submitted. Council members may have questions about that. And there was a supplemental piece of testimony to which Mr. Aramburu and other parties have objected to the ability to supplement. I think it's a very limited item and it's been admitted, I believe, but I'm going to ask that if Ms. Massengale has that, we had a bit of an exchange yesterday as to how that was submitted and making sure it wasn't submitted, particularly Mr. McMahon, as an exhibit, but as an attachment supporting documentation for the motion you had to supplement the record. And I think Ms. Massengale and I managed to exchange that document. She may be able to screen share it so we can let the council members know the very limited subject of cross-examination that might be coming up for Mr. Kobus. And by the way, I'm going to ask if Mr. Kobus is here. We can get him queued up on my screen. Ms. Massengale, I'm not looking for the deposition itself, but for that motion to supplement the deposition that had a few pages submitted by Mr. McMahon. All right, she's looking for that. Mr. Kobus, while we're waiting for that, I will go ahead and give you the oath of witness to that any of the questions you might answer today would be under oath. The deposition's already been submitted under oath. And Mr. McMahon, would you like him to adopt that supplemental testimony as well? The deposition was already submitted into evidence, and that was done under oath, I'm sure. So,
Yes, please, Your Honor.
all right, Mr. Kobus, nice to meet you again on a screen. I think I first met you on a screen when you introduced the project to the council and at the informational meeting 2.5 years ago. Nice to see you again. If you'll raise your right hand. Do you, Dave Kobus, solemnly swear or affirm that all the testimony and the form of answers you'll give today to any questions, as well as the supplement to your deposition testimony, is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do, sir.
All right. Thank you. All right. Ms. Massengale's informed me she does have that. Mr. McMahon, I'm going to ask that Ms. Massengale display those pages that were the quick supplemental testimony that's been adopted now, just so the council members can see it. I don't think it had been previously uploaded to a folder, but I just want them to see the limited nature of it. And have you introduce Mr. Kobus, and then I'll turn to Mr. Aramburu. So this document, Ms. Massengale, if you just scroll through it slowly, it won't take but a few minutes for council members to read what's on their screen. And this document will be made available to council members as part of the evidence they review as you make your recommendations. There we go. Thank you for scrolling in a very humane speed, Ms. Massengale. All right, council members, does anybody need more time to review this supplement to the Cobus deposition? Just raise your hand if you do, and we can direct Ms. Massengale back to whichever page. All right, not seeing any hands. Mr. McMahon, I'm going to turn it over to you. If there's anything you want called to attention, we can put it back on the screen, but I think hopefully everybody's had a chance to review it. I'd like you to introduce Mr. Cobus, maybe give some background on the supplement, and if needed, to go into any other areas before we have Mr. Aramburu ask his questions. The more you ask, the more he'll ask.
I've learned that over the last 2 weeks. Thank you, Your Honor. And I think a little context here is going to be important. But first of all, I think that the exhibit is Exhibit 1064. And I hope Ms. Massengale agrees with that. If she doesn't, then I'm not sure what I'll do. But and so we would ask that that be admitted.
I'll state that the current state of the exhibit list does not have a 1064, but I'll ask her to extract that from the motion and mark that as such so we can keep track of it on the exhibit page.
That's great. All right. Thank you, Your Honor. So, as at least the parties are aware, Mr. Aramburu deposed Mr. Cobus some time ago. And one of the lines of questioning had to do with the Battery Energy Storage Facility, or BESS. And specifically, there was testimony in that deposition about how in the unlikely event of fires at the Battery Energy Storage Facility, how fires would be extinguished. And at that time, and this was a month or so ago, I think, at that time, the methodology for fire suppression that Scout understood, and frankly, most of the industry, I think, understood, was a water suppression system. A water suppression system that would deal with any potential unlikely fires. Since then, there's been a fair amount of movement in the industry and some adoption of some new and additional standards that indicate that fire suppression is not a good idea at battery energy storage facilities. And in fact, and these facilities, by the way, are in separate containers. And if there's a fire, it's not like everything catches fire. It's a contained situation within containers. Just for background, that's incredibly non-technical summary of it from somebody who's couldn't be less of an engineer. So the new standard in the industry that's been reviewed and suggested by agencies and entities that regulate this sort of thing indicates that in the event of a
Mr.
fire.
Examiner, there's testimony going on here,
Yes.
not the introduction of the exhibit. So that's not here to listen to Mr. McMahon's testimony about this. So I object to this.
Your Honor, I'm not testifying to the facts of anything. I'm just trying to set the stage here. And as I recall, it was the council really that asked for this, for some explanation of this information. So I'm just simply trying to set the stage here, Your Honor. And I'm just about done.
I figured you would be. I was having some of the same feelings that Mr. Aramburu had, but not quite as strongly. And the council, I think, has learned by this point in the proceeding that what the attorneys say is not the testimony and the evidence. So, but with all due respect, maybe we could hear a little bit more from Mr. Cobus on how he understands and why he submitted this. So I think Mr. Aramburu's point is well taken. Much as I like the mellifluent tones of Tim McMahon, let's hear from Mr. Cobus.
Yes, his tones will be better than my tones. So, Mr. Cobus, would you please go ahead and introduce yourself and your role with the facility and explain kind of what's going on for the good of the council. And with that, I will go on mute.
Judge Dorham, we are here as I don't know quite what phase of this proceeding we're in. There was Mr. Cobus was to come
Mr.
forward.
Aramburu, we're in the last couple hours. Just wait, please. Let Mr. Cobus state what he's doing, and I swear you're gonna get to ask him questions. Just wait.
I want my objection to be on the record.
It is clear already. I'll ask staff to mute you if you won't mute yourself. Mr.
I want
Kobus,
my-
please introduce yourself and ask the questions and mute Mr. Aramburu. Something bad has now happened.
Sure. Thank you, Your Honor. I'm Dave Kobus. I'm the resident project manager for the Horse Heaven Clean Energy Center. I've been involved in the project since the early days, was integral with the development of the application for site certification. You know, I have a strong bench at Scout of experts in every aspect of project development. You know, in fact, you know, we are the ones responsible to make sure we're intending to design something that meets all of the criteria, as well as is, you know, optimal design and environmentally safe and cited in a proper manner, and all stakeholders and agencies that work with us get the best we can offer them as to how to handle these facilities once they're constructed. So I was deposed recently, and I was deposed on initially the content of the application that was created back in February of 2021. And the questioning, you know, went through the process of what's in our application. We established that, you know, the fire suppression design that was included was a water suppression system. Since that application was filed, we've been following the industry, both in fire protection standards as well as UL standards, as well as design related to battery energy storage systems. In fact, Scout hired an expert recently, Craig Gustafson, who's been assisting me with the specifics of this facility. Well, to shorten the story a bit, we started straying with questions away from what was in the ASC to where are we going to get the water for the fire suppression? Are these facilities safe? Are you aware of what's happening in the world and in the industry related to lithium ion storage batteries? And so I started responding with what was in the document, knowing full well that I had efforts ongoing within Scout to be able to assure that the design that we ultimately procure, and have not done so yet, so we have to specify what we want, we have to procure the design. So, you know, that's a work in progress. And so I was responding to questions related to what was in the ASC, and you know, indicated it says that we intend to have water fire suppression. And I knew in the back of my mind that there's a parallel effort ongoing within Scout to make sure we have the safest type of suppression system. So immediately after I was questioned, I contacted my legal counsel and indicated I knew we had efforts ongoing, and in fact found out that we recently had an interface with a fire marshal in California for a facility we're developing there, and had in fact evolved what Scout is intending to require in our procurement to make sure these systems are safe. And so I felt compelled to ask my attorney to get FSEC the best available information on what we've learned in very recent times. And understand there's an NFPA standard now, a 2023 edition that specifically addresses these types of facilities. And there's also UL standards that we have now evolved that we can require of the designers and the manufacturers of these facilities that we intend to contract.
And Mr. Kobus, UL is the underwriter's laboratory, is that right?
That is correct.
I think with that introduction, that covers the scope of what was in and the background. The council does have your deposition and may have had a chance to review it already. They may have some separate questions about the scope of that. Mr. Aramburu will ask you questions based on the scope of what Mr. Mann was introducing, what you've just said, and what was in the supplemental testimony that will be Exhibit 1064. Mr. Aramburu, please come off mute, and now it's your turn.
I want to continue to object to the process. We had a deposition. The request is to supplement the deposition. It is not a supplement to the deposition. It is adding brand new material. It's improper to supplement the deposition in that fashion. And my second objection to the supplementation of the testimony is that the deposition at which he stated and agreed with the application, the updated application, by the way, was that water was going to be used as one of the fire suppressant elements, was on July 21st. And it was not brought to our attention that that testimony was wrong or incorrect or needed to be supplemented until August, I believe it was August 9th. About more than 2 weeks after the testimony in the middle of these proceedings. So part of my objection is that we have been surprised with material. We have not had an opportunity to review it. We've not had an opportunity to bring experts together on this subject matter. So that is part of our objection, and we continue our request to supplement the record. Now, with respect to Mr. Kobus's testimony, let me ask him this question. You appeared at the deposition and you indicated that the method, or one of the methods of fire suppression was sprinklers, did you not?
Yes, I did.
And you were well aware at the time that there were other considerations that were ongoing at Scout as to fire suppression for the lithium-ion batteries, weren't you?
That's correct.
And you did not say anything about that during the course of the deposition, did you?
My responses were to your questions, which asked, is our design safe? And at the time we submitted our application that had the capability for water fire suppression was considered safe. I then, became concerned because I was saying that we will install a safe system. We will require it of our vendors, that I needed to follow up with the expert at Scout to understand if we can still live with our design in the ASC. I mean, you can't revise this on the fly. All of this takes a considerable team effort, and changing the application could involve an amendment. You don't do that in the middle of an adjudication unless there's a compelling reason to correct something, in this case, that we feel was not adequate level of design safety.
You know all of this well before July 21st, didn't you?
No, I didn't.
In your deposition at page 124, I asked you whether automatic sprinkler systems would be installed. Asking if you saw that question. And so it is the intention of Scout to put automatic sprinklers in the best operations. And you answer yes. I mean, that's our statement. Is that what you said?
What was in the ASC. We had not made a change at that moment. I answered that question. We had not made a change to the Horse Heaven design to provide, well, to say literally that, no, we are not going to use that suppression. These are modular facilities that are
You've answered my
equipment.
question, Mr. Kobus. You've answered my question.
Okay.
Okay. Now, and when did you become aware that there was going to be a change?
when I followed up after the deposition with Craig Gustafson, and he provided me this information related to what he had recently negotiated with the fire marshal in California.
So why did it take until August 8th or 9th to inform us that the deposition testimony was incorrect?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to this. We filed a motion to supplement the testimony. And Your Honor ruled in favor of that motion to supplement the testimony. So we've been through this already. And I would ask that Mr. Rambrew be directed to move on to something else other than the time it took to get it or the rationale for asking for the supplement, because Your Honor ruled on this.
Mr.
Okay,
Rambrew,
I
I
don't-
did. You want to be heard?
No, my request has been continuously, this was sprung on us just a few days before the hearing was to start. We were in the midst of hearing preparation. And we get this as a last minute surprise without real opportunity to investigate the circumstances. I've indicated continuously that we need some opportunity to examine this more carefully without the press of time with day-long hearings. So that's been our request.
Your Honor, if I may respond, Mr. Rambrew has had, since then, the deposition till today, ample opportunity to secure another witness or to otherwise challenge his testimony. This testimony is about nothing more than providing this citing counsel with the best information for the safest possible facility that we can provide as part of the design. Nothing more.
And I think Mr. McMahon and Mr. Rambrew, every other person watching today is very clear about what's going on here, what limited supplementation's gone on, and they've learned about the application process, the need to file an updated, amended ASC before and after the adjudication, and that things change. Mr. Rambrew, fearing to tread where angels go and acknowledging Proverbs 17:28. Do you have any further questions?
Our objection is on the record. Our request for additional time is on the record. We have no further questions.
All right, thank you. Mr. McMahon, I'm going to ask if Chair Drew or the council members had anything for Mr. Kovas based on the deposition or what we've heard today. There's a couple hands going up. Chair Drew, I'm going to come to you, and then we'll come back to Ms. Osborne and Lenny Young.
Hi, Mr. Kovas. Thank you for joining us today. I, for one, am very happy that we're going to continue to look at what is the safest possible installation and fire suppression system that we can have. I guess my question is, do you think that could change further in the future? Because as you know, even once, should the application, let's start with that, be approved, that there still is lag time in terms of even securing and then beginning construction. But this is a relatively new area of development in the world. So I guess my question to you is, do you have ideas about how we can, until we get to that point where we absolutely, should this be approved, have to move forward? How will we proceed in making sure we have the safest option?
Thank you, Chair Drew. Appreciate the question. Recognizing I'm not an expert on these systems, what I am expert at is assuring that we demand of our vendors and manufacturers that they meet the standards that we require at the time we procure equipment. At the time of our original ASC filing, water suppression systems were a standard component of the designs. And, as I've stated previously, the technology is evolving. And, at this point, it's becoming more understood what causes fires in lithium-ion batteries and what can assist in suppressing them. We're finding that copious volumes of water, even if it were available, in fact, could increase the hazard associated with thermal runaway. It's not an oxygen-fed fire. So gaseous type of suppression systems aren't going to work. And so those are the two ways, the technology associated with the extinguishing agent and the firefighting techniques are the only conceivable ways that I've been informed of or read that are being considered. And so I think we're at the peak of the evolution now, where the NFPA Society is very engaged. And
Can
in
you say
fact,
what the NFPA is?
National Fire Protection Association.
Thank you.
It is very engaged. They have a standards committee. In fact, Craig Gustafson is on the NFPA standards committee that's developing these new standards.
And for people's knowledge, who is Craig Gustafson?
Craig Gustafson is our scout design expert that we hired several months ago and leads up this procurement activity and vendor interface and design interface and project development interface at Scout for installing these systems.
Thank
so
you.
I don't see anything better on the horizon. I see what we found as quite an achievement. I wish I could have had this at my tip of my tongue when Mr. Rambrew was questioning me, but I sure felt I needed to follow up and get it to him as soon as we could. And that was as soon as we could.
Thank you. I agree with you, setting the standards in the procurement. So if the standards do change before that time, we would then have the opportunity to make sure we have the safest system. So I agree with that approach. Thank you.
All right, let's come to Elizabeth Osborne next, and Lenny Young, I'll get you after that.
Thank you, Your Honor. Hi, Mr. Kobus. My name is Elizabeth Osborne. I am the council member from the Department of Commerce, and I have some questions about these technologies that I hope you can help clarify for me. You did just mention that you're not an expert directly on the technology, so I'll understand if you can't. But am I right in understanding from your testimony that it's safer to simply let a fire burn itself out? Is that a fair but simplistic characterization?
Yeah, what we found is that the designs are evolving where they're basically containerized equipment modules, and there is no need for personnel entry. So there is no life safety fire suppression need, which was the origination of the water fire suppression design with these units. And so the new strategy is you containerize it, you contain it. If there's a fire, you let it burn itself out. And if the container gets hot, you make sure it just doesn't ignite vegetation and other combustible materials around it. And so it's very minimal use of water.
That's helpful. I have just a couple of follow-ups if you don't mind. Is the containment technology itself, what goes around the battery system, is that new, or has that been a part of these battery configurations up till now, but and doesn't represent any kind of physical configuration change to the battery system?
No, it's an evolution. I mean, in the earlier days, and still now, they're designing battery storage that are in buildings. So they're in big buildings, like at Moss Landing in California, where they have all of these modularized batteries, but they're within a building, and people go in and do maintenance. The evolution has been now to plan to have them in these containerized units. And I'm sure that the design of these containers is evolving relative to this experience that's being gained in doing the post-mortem evaluation of battery problems that have occurred.
That's helpful. And you mentioned the project in California. Are there other applications of this approach to fire suppression going on at other projects in the region or the country to your knowledge?
A good question. What I'm hearing, and again, Craig Gustafson is on this standards committee, and this is the front of the spear in determining how to combat potential problems with all the environmental hazards that are involved while this container burns. And so this is the latest technology, and I believe it is being adopted industry-wide.
Thank you. That concludes my question.
Lenny Young?
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Kobus, my name is Lenny Young, and I'm representing the State Department of Natural Resources on FSEC. Could you be a little more specific about what safety aspects this change in methods is intended to go for? Are we talking it's safer for firefighter? Is this for firefighter safety? Is it to reduce the risk of a catastrophic explosion? Beyond the general idea of safety, what specific safety elements is this change in methods intended to get at?
Yes, appreciate the question, Lenny. I'm starting to get to know you by voice. So no need for introductions. The material that we submitted was intended to put this all in perspective. It's not only the design of the equipment, which is the UL 9540 listing, it's the full-scale fire testing of that equipment, which is the UL 9540 alpha regulation. And then the NFPA 855 is the full accompaniment of design elements and training elements and fire suppression elements that are involved with the installation of these systems. And I might also add that part of this new criteria is that you do a hazard mitigation analysis of the installation that you intend to procure at the point in time that it can do you some good when you're specifying and procuring the equipment. So it trickles down all the way to the local fire department that we intend to support over the life of the project.
I think I might have made my question a little too complicated. I was just trying to find out if it's safer to let the fire burn itself out than to put water on it. Well, how is it safer? Does it reduce firefighter risk? Does it reduce the risk of a catastrophic explosion? Why and how is it safer to use one technique than the other?
Appreciate that distinction. My understanding is that it has to do with improved safety of the fire responders when it's one of these internal type faults that can occur in the battery. And we're seeing evidence that there are actually fires that are caused by these internal faults that have gone on longer than necessary, in some case days longer, when water is continually applied to it. And so we believe this will shorten the time of a contained fire, shorten the need for firefighter response, and therefore reduce the risk to those responders.
Okay, thanks. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear. And are all the combustion products, when the fire is allowed to burn, are all the combustion products contained within the container for the entire duration of the fire?
That's a great question. My understanding is these new designs have evolved, and that is an important consideration. But I can't respond any further about what venting might have to occur to assure there isn't an explosive hazard. And so that's the extent of the response I can provide.
Okay, and
in your answer to one of the previous questions, you said a consideration is to make sure the container doesn't get so hot that it ignites vegetation or combustible materials in the immediate vicinity of the container. Wouldn't it be prudent to ensure that there was no such vegetation or combustibles around the container to doubly prevent that kind of a thing from happening? Great point, Lenny. I appreciate you asking it. That in fact is the main reason for the fence that goes around these facilities. And there will be setback and vegetation-free zones and fire break areas, not only from the fence to the containers, but between the containers within the fenced area. And I have just one final question for you, and that is simply, is there any downside? As the experts have looked into, researched, and recommend this change in firefighting methods, it sounds like it's on track for improving safety, but is there any downside? Is there any trade-off that you get something else that you don't want as a result of making this change in methods? I appreciate the question. And there possibly is, and that's why I'm not saying it's absolutely safe. I'm saying this hazard mitigation analysis that'll be performed by experts in this field will be able to certify that for us. Thank you. I appreciate your answers.
All right, I see that Eli Levitt, Department of Ecology, has some questions for you as well. You might know his voice.
Hello, Mr. Kobus. My name is Eli Levitt. I'm the Department of Ecology's EFSAC council member. I guess I just offer very briefly that my agency has some experience with responding to lithium-ion battery fires, and there has been a lot of new research and change in this field just in the past 6 months or a year, including an interagency group. So anyways, I know just a bit about it, but one thing I'd quickly ask is that has the applicant or your vendors done any research on how the batteries will be decommissioned at the end of life, or what you would do with them if there were a fire?
Great question, Councilmember Levitt. We are anticipating that the vast majority of these battery facilities will be recyclable. In fact, there's industry information available to the public that shows how the recycling techniques are improving. And so, our intention is that we will recycle to the maximum extent practical. And of course, our decommissioning plans have to restore us to the green field that it was prior to building the project. And so, as I say, in that endeavor, we will attempt to recycle and salvage as much as possible.
Yeah, I guess in the case when they do burn, they become a different type of waste. So, I assume you would need a different type of plan in the case of a fire, but.
And I can't speak to that, but I can speak to the fact that, I know the way we manage scout projects, we will find the absolute optimal way to dispose of whatever does occur. But I can't say I've seen it personally myself.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
Council members, any other questions for Mr. Kobus? Seeing none. Other parties? Ms. Volkers, I saw your hand go up.
Thank you, Your Honor, and good afternoon, Mr. Kobus. I don't have a question for Mr. Kobus, but I do want to make an objection on the record when it's appropriate, Your Honor.
Now it's fine.
We've heard from a number of witnesses over the last couple of weeks that sponsored significant portions of the ASC and did not write them. I would like to make, or I suppose, maybe renew a general due process objection that allowed applicant to withhold Mr. Kobus from examination by all parties, either through direct testimony or deposition until less than a month before this hearing. Understand that we are not being allowed time to rebut what we're hearing today. And unfortunately, we have not heard directly from the fire chief, which I certainly would have questions for myself. I just at this point renew our objection and ask that the council rely only upon representations by any witness, including ours, that are supported by credible citations at this point. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Volkers. Your objection's noted for the record. I think the council is aware that Mr. Kobus presented things starting in February of 2021 and perhaps before, that he was the representative for this applicant, that the statements contained in the application, any amendments come in with multiple authors and are presented for the council as part of the application review. As far as you note for this adjudication, your objection is well taken. These matters are on a parallel track with the SEPA process, which we're not getting into here, as we all know, but the council is going to get all of this information and understands what was presented here under cross-examination for the adjudication is a different animal than what's going on in SEPA. That's being vetted through different processes than the adjudication. So I understand your objection. Clearly, I'm not going to grant any additional time or strike witnesses or grant anything other than what we'll talk about in the final housekeeping for any supplemental testimony that parties wish to move to have the council consider or be admitted by stipulation or otherwise. Any other party questions before I come back to Mr. Aramburu to see if he has further questions? All right, Mr. Aramburu, any final questions for Mr. Kobus? Perhaps based on the ones that the council asked? And you'll have to come off mute to do so.
Supplemental material that you presented here and is asked for admission, has that been submitted to the Benton County Fire District #1?
Good question. I haven't, no,
Okay, so they haven't seen it.
I don't know.
No further questions.
Mr. McMahon, anything else for this witness?
I don't believe so, Your Honor, unless any of the council members wants a better understanding of the modularization of these facilities and how that has some bearing on fire. But I'm guessing that we've had enough for today on this topic. But if there were further questions about that, that is a piece that I didn't think was perhaps developed enough through council questions.
Council members, anyone want to take Mr. McMahon up on his invitation, modular portions of this? Mr. McMahon, I'm not seeing anybody take that bait, so I imagine they've got what they need.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. Kobus, thanks for being available today. And we have the deposition, we have the supplement to the testimony and the rest of the development of that evidence. Parties, I think that was the end. As I go back and look at the schedule for today, the end of what we were attempting to do, we still have a question about Casey McWallahy's testimony. Council members, if I hadn't said it already to you, Councilmember Wallahy is still in ceremonies and is not able to be with us today with the events going on with his family in the Yakima Nation. His testimony pre-filed has been stipulated to be admitted. It doesn't appear that we're going to get to hear him live, certainly not today, for him to speak to the council as the other tribal members have. Mr. McMahon, was there any other evidence that the applicant intended to present during the adjudication?
I don't believe so, Your Honor, but I bet late at night I'll think of it, but no, thank you.
Yeah, and we did our housekeeping this morning, and I think all of the applicant's exhibits have been covered. And so the final exhibit list as it stands will be going out at some point in the days ahead from Ms. Massengale. Mr. Harper, good afternoon. Anything further from the county? Has all evidence that the county wishes to submit in the record now?
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Coming to counsel for the environment, Ms. Reineveld, have you now presented all the evidence that counsel for the environment wish to have before the council?
I have. I did want to follow up on just Yakima Nation's motion for the 2 additional WDFW wildlife witnesses, and just confirm that Your Honor was going to be making a written ruling as a follow-up to your verbal ruling. And I wanted to state also on the record that Council for the Environment agrees with Yakima Nation that both of these witnesses have very relevant expertise in wildlife and habitat issues, and believe that their testimony would be helpful in clarifying testimony given even as late as today. So Council for the Environment would like to understand, I think, more specifically, the specific legal basis for your denial in writing, specifically as just this discovery depositions of both of these witnesses have been admitted into evidence, and the admission of supplemental and also responsive testimony has been very liberal in these proceedings. So I think understanding that specific legal basis for denial would be helpful for us to consider whether or not we would like to request reconsideration.
Thank you, Ms. Reineveld. And let me clarify, this was not a ALJ ruling. This was a question posed in writing by Ms. Volkers to Ms. Bumpus and to the presiding officer as the counsel. I simply relayed the decision of the presiding officer in this matter, as well as the director of the agency. I do believe that Ms. Bumpus will be reducing that to writing and responding to Ms. Volkers with a copy to all parties. The only legal basis for that will be supplied by the assistant attorneys general who advise the council. So again, it's clear, to be clear, it's not the administrative law judge's ruling. That letter was not addressed to me. It came during the course of the adjudication, and I've simply, as a courtesy, am relaying so you know now what the decision of the council was. I hope that helps, Ms. Reineveld.
That does help. Still a legal basis in the context of that response from FSEC and the Attorney General's office would be helpful.
Yes, and your colleagues at the Attorney General's office are more than equipped to do that. Aside from that, was there anything else from Council for the Environment on what they needed in the record?
No, nothing further. Thank you.
Ms. Volkers, I'm coming to you with the same questions, but does the Yakima Nation have all the evidence, including the stipulated testimony of Casey McWallahey, that the Yakima Nation wanted the council to consider as part of the adjudication?
Thank you, Your Honor. We do not have any additional evidence. I would, just as a follow-up to what was just discussed, like to be very clear on the record. I know that things have been done verbally and in writing the last couple weeks. Yakima Nation is making a motion to the presiding officer, and so I just wanted to make that clear, and would, and as I think I said yesterday, appreciate a written response from our presiding officer on this matter. So thank you.
All right. Mr. Aramburu, I'm coming to you to see what other evidence. We have Lonnie Click's testimony that's been stipulated to. We still have a supplement to that coming when we get Chair Drew's questions answered. And hopefully that will be an opportunity for Mr. Click in the days ahead. But aside from that pending response, does the Tri-Cities Cares Group have any other evidence that they think is not already in the record?
Judge Storm, we have continuously through these proceedings indicated our objections to the hurried and compressed nature of these proceedings, which have prejudiced us in terms of preparation of testimony for the council. We have made presentations, but they have been impacted by the shortness of time and the compressed nature of these proceedings. So I cannot say that we have had an opportunity to present all the evidence we wish to present. I can tell you now that we think, well, first of all, the material presented by Mr. Kobus today, we've not had an opportunity to thoroughly review that material and form opinions as to whether a response is necessary. Secondly, we think the council should have additional information on view impacts and particularly on alternatives to the project, which would impact views. We've provided some testimony on that. but we've heard a number of questions from the council. We think some additional evidence on that point is appropriate, and in general, to the question of possible alternatives to the project that can not only address visual aesthetic issues, but, and I won't speak for other council, but there have been some questions raised by the Yakima Nation. There's been questions raised by the county and others. So we think some opportunity for supplemental testimony on those points should be allowed to us, given the compressed nature of these proceedings. And we'd be ready to go with some supplemental testimony on either September 11 or 15.
All right, thank you, Mr. Aramburu. On the motion for supplemental testimony, I'm going to allow for all parties, if they wish, to file a written motion to supplement the record with whatever testimony and an offer of proof, if not the actual testimony. Those motions will be due no later than Tuesday, September 5th at 5 o'clock. Any requests to supplement the record that come in at 5:01 are summarily denied, and anything thereafter I'm not even going to look at. Tuesday, September 5th, 5 o'clock. Have a good Labor Day weekend, but Tuesday, September 5th is the deadline for those motions. I will immediately look at them on the night of Tuesday, September 5th, and endeavor to have an order out the next day, or I'm looking at my calendar. I've got time on the 5th. I have a hearing on the 7th, so I'll aim for the night of the 5th and the 6th to get you an order on the supplemental testimony. If we're going to have a supplemental hearing, it would be on the 11th or the 15th. At this time, I'm not seeing a need to schedule it formally, but the council's been asked to hold that. Based on what I see in the written motions with identified testimony and witnesses, I'll be able to quickly make a decision if we need to change those dates into formal hearing dates, but make a justification why a written supplemental testimony won't be sufficient.
May I ask, Judge Torm, would you like on September 5 to have the request for the testimony or the testimony itself?
Much as Mr. McMahon set an example by attaching the proposed supplemental testimony of Mr. Kobus, I think that would be the format, given the compressed decision timing we need to get that to me. So have the testimony ready. Count on it being considered as attached. If I think there's a need for other parties to object before I can make a quick ruling and just a judgment on whether it's within the bounds that we've set and whether I think it will help the council, I want to get this done quickly, particularly if we need to have a further hearing date on the 11th or the 15th. So submit it. I don't want just the name and the idea. I want the actual testimony included. That's a good clarification, Mr. Aramburu. All right, we have all the evidence in, council members. I understand there's going to be a quick meeting of the minds here at 3 o'clock where we'll talk about what happens next, perhaps talk about dates for our ultimate time for deliberations. But again, it's not a time to decide anything now. You've had plenty of the last 2 weeks information presented. We'll just again talk about what council procedure is once the adjudication is closed. And we'll know September 6th or thereabouts whether there's going to be any supplemental hearing dates. And we'll kind of talk about which of those dates might be preferable for all council members when we get together here in 20 minutes. Chair Drew, is there anything else that you want to put on the record for the adjudication? I have 2 other housekeeping items for the parties.
No, thank you everyone for your participation. Thank you, council, for your participation, and we look forward to the next step.
All right, thank you,
for your
council
attention.
members.
Thank you for your attention, Chair Drew and the other council members, to our presentations.
All right, we're going to pause for 2 minutes just to stretch. We'll come back at 2:45 with the housekeeping session to wrap things up for the day.